Chapter 1.
Extermination.
The worst
Jonathan
things about
Bartell,
Olympus
Space
were the
Agent.
corridors. They were
Written
grey
and narrated
featureless,
by Patty
with a grey
Jansen.
floor covering, grey walls, a grey ceiling that was almost low enough to touch, and an endless progression of doors on each end. The doors bore little plaques with numbers, but other than that, there was no indication to show where you were. Of course, while coming here as delegates for the conference, Jonathan and Gaby were only allowed to see a very small part of the station, and that was more than enough to know that it was a mind-numbing, confusing warren of a place that harkened back to its low-budget commercial origins. For the duration of the conference, Jonathan occupied a room in what was called the B corridor. Gaby was with the women in the C corridor. Already, when going from one to the other, Jonathan had wondered if maybe they should have asked to stay as a couple in the same room. Not that there was a luxury, or as it were, awkwardness, of a double bed available, but at least they would not have wasted so much time looking for each other. But they weren't a couple, as such, although Jonathan wouldn't mind if they were. It was just that, well, he guessed he was afraid she'd say no, and their relationship would be irretrievably broken. They were colleagues, a team. They were meant to do work together. Jonathan's little room had no less than 4 beds, but it was more than amazing to suggest that 4 people were expected to stay in this tiny cubicle for any length of time without killing each other. Well, his and Gaby's work showed that killing each other was in fact a fairly common occurrence in space. Even the breakfast room was small, with a very low ceiling. In fact, the only place where any concessions had been made to the fact that this old commercial station was now used as a conference center was the conference room itself. That side of the dumbbell-shaped station had been renovated, with a beautiful conference room that sported all the newest technology. The accommodation quarters, however, were old and tired, presumably to be upgraded sometime in the future. About 200 delegates had come to this conference on the maintenance of closed ecosystems. It sounded like a boring enough subject, but Jonathan and Gaby had already been through a number of adventures that proved otherwise. It meant recycling. It meant clean air. It meant human waste, like shit. It meant talking about processes and equipment that turned the latter into the former. It meant contamination that might make a habitat unlivable and the atmosphere unstable, and could put the various cleansing and composting processes out of balance. It meant the difference between life and death, and in that respect, this station was quite an unremarkable place to hold a conference about scientific advances in something of that importance. But apparently, the commercial company who ran this conference, a first in the asteroid belt, had big plans for it. When coming in on the shuttle yesterday, Jonathan and Gaby had seen various promotional videos about the big plans the company had for the conference station, hosting military, civilian, and mixed events in this refurbished pimple of a mining station in the asteroid belt. After a brief welcome address by the company, Jonathan and Gaby had been invited to come and have a few drinks with a couple of their colleagues in the B corridor, and that was when Jonathan had gotten lost. He wandered about the corridors with many empty rooms, some in the process of being refurbished. He wandered into corridors that were closed off with tape and had little signs saying "Renovation in progress." He checked his pad for a map, but found that it was forthcoming. What was so difficult about copying a map of this warren of a place? Unless they had to edit out the secret sections. And then a man said behind him, "Oh, Mr. Bartell." Jonathan turned around, hoping to see the research officer who had invited him to the party, but it was a different man. He was tall and slim, looked fit, and was probably in his 50s. He wore a pair of old grey jeans. Seriously, who still had those? They belonged in a museum. And a loose grey jacket with no identifying features. His face, however, looked very military, clean-shaven. Jonathan had no idea what it was with scientists and beards. He had probably been in the conference room for the opening address, but Jonathan didn't know him, so he had not noticed. Jonathan asked, "I'm looking for the B corridor common room. Do you happen to know where that is?" "I'm not a local, but I think I might. Come with me, and we'll go there." His voice sounded oddly formal. He took off down another featureless grey passage. Jonathan tried to figure out whether he had already been here. "Are you enjoying the conference so far?" Jonathan asked, to start the conversation. "I am," the man said, and then let another uncomfortable silence pass between them. "I actually wanted to speak to you." "Me?" "You are Jonathan Bartell, the expert in biocrime." "I'm an expert in recycling. I've had a few adventures at the orbital launch station and also at Johnson Base, but I wouldn't call myself an expert." He hesitated. Jonathan wasn't sure he was allowed to talk about these things to civilians. Probably not. He smiled, feeling uneasy. How did this man know these things anyway? "Oh, you're being too modest. You have quite a reputation." What a strange man. Jonathan was sure that a lot of people at the conference had reputations far greater than his, far more experience and superior research projects. He was just starting his career, and he tended to draw the unlucky project where, as soon as he started, some sort of problem developed. "I think you may be confusing me with my father," Jonathan said. His father did indeed have quite a reputation, both in the force and out. His father had also worked in science, and would probably still have been around by the time this man started his career. "No, I'm talking about you. Although you're right, I did work with your father, who was also a well-respected researcher. In the short time that you've worked for us, you have already done some very good things. You've prevented 2 disasters from happening." "Sorry? Us?" I mean us researchers." 2 red spots developed on his cheeks. Ex-military, clearly, and a really strange character. "I'm sorry I don't know you. What's your name?" "Stevens. Mark Stevens." He shook Jonathan's hand. His palm was sweaty. Jonathan asked, "And you work for—" "I'm in between projects at the moment." "Is there anything I can help you with?" "Yes, there is, actually. Strange that you should ask." "Well, not so strange at all." "Tell me about it. I'm speaking to you in a position of complete confidence. I hope you understand." "Well, yes. Though as far as it relates to the safety of our systems, we're obliged to let the authorities know if we've spotted issues that could cause problems in the management of base recycling systems." The man shook his head. "Oh no, the situation is far beyond that. I really need to talk to you in private." A female voice came from behind. "Oh, there you are." Jonathan turned around. There was Gaby. Thank the heavens. He was glad for her familiar face. She came to him looking flustered, as if she'd been running around. "I've just searched the whole place. I thought you'd gotten lost." Jonathan gave a sheepish grin. "I did get lost. These corridors are ridiculous. They're all the same." "I know. Anyway, the B corridor common room is just around the corner. Come. The party's already started. You won't believe who's there." Jonathan nodded at his mysterious scientist. "Are you coming? There is a pre-conference party going on. Drinks are on the Ceres team. You can talk to me there." The man shook his head. "I'm afraid I don't really like parties very much, but the conference will be for a couple of days. I'll speak to you later. It's not like we'll be going anywhere." No, they were in a space station on the outer rim of the asteroid belt. It was quite isolated, and the only way off the station was via a shuttle bay that held only 2 vehicles at a time. No one was going anywhere in a hurry. Chapter 2. One could only get on with life, because life went on, whether you went with it or not. In space, it was a given that people died, especially people who had looked after themselves as poorly as Ken. Grew up on Mars, never did any of the prescribed exercises, declared that he hated it, ate too much, too often, sat on his backside all day. Tara had never known him to be anything other than unhealthy. He had the works: heart problems, weight problems, diabetes, kidney problems, joint problems, you name it. His demise had come quickly and mercilessly in his living room through a massive heart attack. He had been only 52, and that was altogether too young, but for someone who had neglected his physical form as much as he had probably done quite well. It was just that Tara missed him. He'd been a good boss, even a friend. He used to run the lab in a relaxed fashion, never worrying too much about the work that needed to be done, as long as it did get done. But his side projects were the really interesting part of Ken. Ken was always interested in the work. He'd spend more time in the lab than Tara had ever known any scientists to do. Most of them went to a lot of meetings, let their students do the work, let the junior staff manage the students, and only collected the rewards at the end. Ken was not like that. He hated administrative meetings, and once told the station manager to get fucked over an administrative burden. He said he was here to do science. His mind was as sharp as his body was soft. There were lots of rumors, of course. Ashley, Tara's co-worker in the lab, said that Ken had been under a lot of stress. When Lemura, the company that owned the station, had gone broke, its property had passed into the hands of the Space Force. They were rumored to be sending managers to sort out everything the Force didn't like, and lots of rumors circulated about what those things were. Tara didn't know what to believe, but she'd heard rumors that the lab would be repurposed to look into the use of chemical and biological weapons for military purposes, and Ken was just about as peaceful as anyone could be. He sure had to feel the pressure about this. Many of his experiments didn't come with admin approval. He just started the experiments on a hunch or a whim about topics that interested him, as a way to kill the idle time that one always had plenty of when living in a small community and not being particularly social. Ken had grand plans. He wanted to leave behind a legacy of research that would be useful for people. That was what he always said. She met the new boss for the first time yesterday. His name was Fred Wilkins, and he was a military man, lean and strapping, somewhere in his 50s and wearing a uniform, with his face hard and unemotional. His eyes looked sad, with the eyelids drooping down, and age had turned the corners of his mouth down as well. He looked kind of like a frog in a fairy tale. He asked her some generic questions, and Tara had given him some generic answers, like how many people worked here and what their hours were. Tara thought that if he had been properly briefed on his job, why didn't he know that already? And why didn't he ask about the research? He was obviously not a researcher but a manager. So she asked him what research facility he came from, and got some vague story about quarantine at the moon bases. That didn't fill her with confidence. Quarantine was important, but not the same as research. Maybe the Space Force lumped it under research, because his uniform said Special Services, but that still didn't make it research. What was his interest, she asked him, to which he replied that in the Force you didn't have the luxury of delving into interests. Life in space in the Force is lived on a knife's edge. We are here to solve the problems faced by the frontline troops. Then what are we going to do in this lab? I'll take stock of what is here, and then we'll turn this into a first-rate facility. Implying that it wasn't already good and that nothing of what they were doing mattered. He inspected Ken's office, which he was in the process of cleaning up, and his face showed distaste. No, it wasn't a military-style, sterile and clean place, with not a piece of equipment out of place. Ken's office was full of obsolete equipment, stacked on the shelves in haphazard fashion, with cords dangling down. Ken had books, the paper variety, which were quite rare in a place like a space station. He always believed in keeping the useful parts of technology alive. He kept quite a bit of non-useful technology too, hoarding it in his room, just in case. Books were handy, he said, because you could leave them open and look things up. The new boss just stood at the entrance to the office. I'll make sure I clean it all up, Tara said, and then she felt annoyed at the thought that she should apologize for the state of the room. It was none of his business. Had he actually arrived when they said he would, everything would have been cleaned up. Yes. They were very quick assigning a new person to this position. I hadn't expected you to arrive so soon. She wanted to know where he came from and why he was here so quickly. In her experience, it usually took months for the bureaucracy to churn through its cogs, and a little more time for more bureaucracy to let the other person leave their old position, and then still more for a ticket of passage to be secured from wherever the person was. The research division of the Space Force had to be desperate. She wasn't sure if this was a good or a bad thing. He walked through the lab in between the benches, stopping here and there to look at some of the work going on. Tara had been analyzing samples from plants that they used for nutritional experiments. It was always a challenge to keep people fed in a space station, and the crops they grew in the agricultural facilities were engineered to deliver the maximum amount of nutrition. The analysis lab was a separate room from the experimental facility, separated by a hermetically sealed door. Beyond that door was where they grew the crops in trays, the trays slotted into shelving units that had several banks of lighting. These units could be moved around according to experiment design. The chamber was an old entry bay through which cargo used to come when the station had just been built. The airlock was still there and operational. Ken used it for some of his private experiments. The lights were currently on in the controlled environment room, with a bright glow coming from the little window of the door into the lab. The new manager stopped at the door and looked into the room. The glow lit his face. "Mushrooms," he said, which was obvious. He glanced aside to the hazard suits that hung in the suiting room next to the door, as if deliberating if it would be worth his time getting dressed and going inside. He decided against it. What type? These are called chanterelles, and this type comes from the beech forests of Norway. Are they poisonous? Heavens, no. They're considered a delicacy. So, good eating, huh? Did the previous boss enjoy mushroom cook-up fests? Seriously, what sort of a remark was that? Yes, Ken carried too much weight, and he did enjoy his sautéed mushrooms, but that had nothing to do with the work here. He continued through the lab, oblivious to her annoyance. He stopped at the drying oven, looking in through the glass door. The shelves inside were crammed with trays of material that Ashley had harvested yesterday. "Carrots," he said. "We are testing these to see if we can breed better carrots that are more resistant to leaf molds and rots that we have problems with in closed environments. We have normal orange carrots, purple carrots and yellow carrots from old seed collections in Europe. Some of the older varieties are a lot hardier." Yes. Seriously, was that all he could say? He continued, "Very well. I will need a list of all the trials you're doing here and any results you have. I will evaluate this for usefulness compared with the cost. I will start tomorrow. I will want to use the office over there." He glanced at the mess that was Ken's office. "Sure," Tara said. "I'll prepare a list. I would hope that we can continue our current trials. We've put a lot of effort into them." "For the time being, yes," but his tone sounded like he didn't expect that to continue. "How will you decide which projects can continue?" "I'll base it on relevance. I'm not the sole person to make decisions. I'll be liaising with Colonel Bartell of Sector Command. She has a view of the overall situation. She gives the ultimate orders based on her knowledge and her orders. Military knowledge and military orders. Great. By the way, what do you want me to call you?" He replied without hesitation. "We are now a military installation, so you can call me by my rank." "And how does that work?" "Lieutenant Wilkins." And he turned on his heel and left the room again. Seriously, what a jerk. Call me by my rank. No, privately, she was going to call him Freddy the Frog. Chapter 3. Jonathan walked with Gaby down the hallway in the direction of an open door. through which he could already hear the sound of many people talking. He looked over his shoulder to see the strange man walking off around the corner. "Who was that?" Gaby asked. "Good question. An odd character. His name is Mark Stevens. Have you ever heard of him?" Being a doctor, Gaby was far better at remembering names than he was. She shook her head. "It's a pretty nondescript name. It doesn't ring any bells. He wanted to speak to me in complete confidence." "Don't they all?" She laughed. "Everyone is full of secrets." One of her fields of study was human behavior in close quarters of a ship or station. She claimed that everyone went a little nuts in space. But Jonathan didn't laugh. "I don't know about this. Either he's completely crazy or he's got something serious to say." "Well, we'll be in this hole for a few days. I'm sure you'll hear about it if it's really that important." Jonathan wasn't altogether sure he wanted to hear about it. Jobs to solve problems came to him via the usual channels, his supervisors at headquarters on Earth. They reached the common room, full of talking and laughing people, and were greeted with cheers. A whole bunch of people sat on couches around a low table. There was a kitchenette in the corner, where various containers with beverages stood, all of them open. A good number of the faces in the room were familiar, and the various military off-duty outfits even more so. "Jonathan!" That was Ben from the orbital launch station. He clapped Jonathan on the shoulder. "Man, how are you?" Jonathan shook his old colleague's hand. Ben had grown a little fuller in the face. "Look at you. An exercise regime is hard to stick to in space, right?" Ben laughed. "Watch out what you say. I'm a married man now." "You're kidding. Cindy?" "The very one. Is she here?" "I wish. They wouldn't pay for both of us to come." "Are you still with the launch station?" "Yup. Boring compared to you, I know. I've heard lots of things about you. Good things, I hope. You've made a bit of a reputation for yourself, man, defying a superior and all that." That was about his last job on the moon. "It was all within guidelines." "Barely so, but that aside." Gaby was talking to someone else. Jonathan spotted a few more people he recognized from the launch station, and even a few from university on Earth. "What are you all doing here?" Jonathan asked. "I thought you were in agriculture." "You know how important recycling is," Ben said. He winked. "The whole research division at the orbital launch station has been diverted into it." That was a surprise development. Not only that, but quarantine and recycling were considered the poor cousins of space biology research, especially at the orbital launch station, because protecting Earth from alien microorganisms was very unsexy work. When he worked there, Jonathan had kept a dangerous bacteria from reaching Earth. It was something with truly terrifying potential. Maybe the authorities finally understood how important quarantine was. Was there a problem? "Haven't you heard?" "Heard what?" Jonathan's heart jumped. He did make an effort to keep up with the news, but he'd been busy preparing for the new project at Ceres. "Opus Station," Ben said, his voice dark. "What about it?" Opus was a small commercial research station in the asteroid belt. It had belonged to the same mining company as Olympus, and its catastrophic habitat failure had been the cause of the company's withdrawal from the area. "People are being mobilized." "What? Why?" "They found the station completely dead, with all the airlocks blown out and wide open." "And what does that mean?" "No matter how catastrophic the failure, no human would leave it like that." Ben's eyes were penetrating. "Wait, are you saying that Command has finally found the aliens they've always claimed were present in the outer system?" "Not claimed. They are present. The Force are sending a fleet of ships to comb the area. At the launch station, it means a lot of sanitation work for us. When the stations and ships are filled to capacity, it's amazing how much recycling stuff can go wrong and how quickly." True, but Jonathan was still puzzled. Did anyone actually see enemy vessels? Surely the news would have been stiff with that information if that was the case. I don't know about that. They're keeping it very close to their chest because they don't want people to panic. But they released this to a friend of mine who was called up for duty. He fiddled with his pad and showed Jonathan a picture of a space station side-lit by pale sunlight. From a distance it looked normal, except there were no lights anywhere on the outside of the station. But when Ben zoomed in, you could see that the airlocks were open and that debris floated around the station. A closer view still showed that not only were the airlocks open, but some had been damaged. "That's pretty depressing, isn't it?" Ben said. "Over 200 people dead, just like that." Many other people in the room fell silent, listening in on the conversation. "We need to go out there and get the bastards who did that," a man whom Jonathan didn't know said. He was from the security division, stood next to Gaby, and appeared to have been talking to her. "Yeah," another said. "We're doing our bit here, keeping the ships and the troops healthy." There were several solemn nods around the room, military people with a strong sense of duty. Jonathan had completed his mandatory military training, but had never felt at ease with that aspect of it, that the answer to any threat is a gun. Internal conflict and the dangers of space formed a much greater threat than anything else he had seen so far. And still, even with the image shown by Ben, there was no evidence of the existence of an alien enemy. The airlock might have blown out, but there was no evidence of a violent cause. He wanted to say, "I'm not seeing bullet holes," but he figured that wouldn't go down too well. These people utterly believed it. They might have information he didn't. It wasn't his place to question the leadership. Jonathan was tired from travelling and a long day, so he beckoned Gaby. "What is it?" "I'm tired. I want to go to bed." "Yeah, sure, I'll come too. Let me just tell Rick." "Rick? You don't remember him? Come, let me introduce you." She took him to the security division officer she had been speaking to. His badge said Lieutenant First Class Arbib. He was a strapping man with dark hair, olive skin, an athletic physique, and the biceps to match, and was at least a head taller than Jonathan. "Rick, this is Jonathan. Jonathan, this is Rick." They shook hands. Jonathan did see something familiar about his face. "Did you work in the orbital launch station?" "I did. I was working in security and processing division. I remember you well. You kicked up quite a stink." Jonathan honestly did not remember him. He wasn't very good at remembering faces, and someone like this proud military officer was really not his type. To be honest, men like that usually made fun of him, so he avoided them. "Are you still at the station?" he asked, because that was the only question he could think of asking. Heavens no, that was a shithole of a job for losers, wasn't it? Yes, Jonathan agreed it was, but probably not for the same reason as Rick. For Jonathan, it had been a bad job, because people thought that his work was inferior and not very important. It was also before he had officially joined the force and had been working for the much maligned Quarantine Authority. "No," Rick went on, "I work in this region now, providing surveillance and security for the settlements and the asteroid belt. We look after natural and unnatural threats to our settlements." He was one of those aliens are going to destroy us types. Someone Jonathan was not going to engage with. What was the man even doing at this conference? He should be off fighting aliens. He nodded at Rick. "Nice to have met you. I was about to go to bed. We've travelled quite a way, and the daylight sequence on the ship and the station aren't the same. So if you'll excuse me—" "Yes, of course. I'll see you over the next few days anyway." Jonathan left the room. Gaby came after him. "Do you honestly not remember him?" she asked. "I was quite busy when I worked at the orbital launch station," Jonathan said. "Busy trying to stop people bullying me off the station, sabotaging my work and making me look ridiculous. He used to provide security for incoming ships. Whenever they had a patient who needed to come to the hospital, he would come with them, and sometimes, if the patient was there because of some violent incident, He would have to sit at the bedside until the patient was well enough to go back to the ship. He was often bored out of his mind, so we would talk and chat. He was so funny. Did he tell you what he's doing here? What do you mean? Well, he doesn't seem to be the scientific type. Opus Station is not so far from here. I suspect he's here to provide a level of security between us and military action, if there is any. Do you really believe there are aliens? Gaby shrugged. They seem convinced. They probably have more information than we do. What about you, personally? I mean, you saw the picture he showed. Yeah, and? Did you see any damage to that station that could only be done through a military attack from outside the station? What are you on about? Did you see any impact holes? I have no idea what form an alien attack would take. If they say it's an alien attack, I have no reason to disbelieve it, if that's what you mean. She frowned at him, her expression disturbed. He said, For years, the Force has spoken of these aliens. At every available opportunity, they've trotted out the aliens, mostly to justify to governments on Earth the insane level of funding they receive. Now would be the time to show clear proof of the existence of these aliens, wouldn't you think so? I'm sure they have a lot more information recorded, probably including from the very moment the station lost pressure. Why aren't they sharing that? Strategic reasons? Yeah, because the aliens can clearly decipher our language and have equipment to receive our transmissions, and they can listen and learn that, hey, we figured out we've been attacked by aliens and we're letting everyone know. I mean, what else would we talk about? And also, if they can understand our language and our transmissions, we're pretty much fucked anyway. So why wouldn't they send everyone in the system messages that say, Help, we're being attacked by aliens, come over here quickly so we can shoot them to bits? Why not? I really don't understand why you get so worked up about it. You don't? Because there is a whole contingent of people here who are all, we're going to bust some alien butt, and they're being hoodwinked. I can't see where you get that impression. Because they are not showing any evidence of the aliens. And here we are, on the edge of what is potentially going to be a war zone, talking about recycling. What can be more absurd than that? They had arrived at Gaby's room. Well, she said uneasily, you certainly have a bee in your bonnet about this. Don't you agree? Wouldn't you think they'd allow us to have this conference here if this sector was really about to break out into a war? Did you see anything that suggested an alien attack in that picture? She said nothing. He knew she could not. Her cheeks were red from the wine or fatigue, or possibly both, and he realized that he had probably hammered a favorite subject a bit too hard. He said, Look, let's just do what we've come here for, right? Gaby yawned. Yes, I'm tired. He bid her an awkward good night, and then Jonathan walked back to his hole in the wall by himself, feeling miserable. He always thought that Gaby could see his side of the argument, and was disturbed that she did not this time. Based on what? The words from some commander that an enemy had destroyed the station? What was so terrible about showing better evidence? Panic? What did they think would cause more panic? Constant rumor or the truth? The light came on automatically when he entered his room, an unappealing cubicle with 2 bunk beds and 1 storage cabinet with 4 doors, although the inner partitions had been removed. He removed his off-duty uniform and changed into his regulation pyjamas. All of the clothing was grey. Then he lay back on the bottom bunk and checked the story on Opus Station. It said the parent company that had owned the station had decided it wanted to withdraw from keeping many small and expensive stations and base their operations in larger population centres. The Force had expressed interest in taking over their infrastructure. People from the Force had arrived at Opus Station, but very little was known about what they found there. A number of days later, the station had been destroyed, killing all crew except one, a middle-aged man by the name of Fred Wilkins. The article did not state it explicitly, but this turned out to be one of the Force workers. Out of interest, Jonathan looked for his profile in the Space Force database. He worked for auxiliary services until recently when he had been honorably retired. That was strange, because if he was the section commander, Jonathan would be bugging the hell out of this person about what he had seen, what had happened, and how it had, no matter how weird their replies were, or how much the person was mentally unstable and unsuitable to continue working. Chapter 4. When Fred had been told about his posting to Opus Station, Colonel Bartell had warned him that the place was a dump. The place has been run by Lemura, and when they got into financial difficulties, they cut back on a lot of maintenance, some of it essential. They also employed a lot of characters who, what shall I say, would not have found employment elsewhere, because they had very strange ideas. The Force has had some minor involvement with some of them, but none that are on the station currently. Am I likely to face discipline issues? I would guess so. This is part of the reason that we've appointed you. Great, that was just what he needed, to be appointed manager of a bunch of staff who didn't want him there. Was he meant to survive this venture? What does the Force want with his little station? At this point in time, we're taking stock of what's there. I want you to go in there and establish safe practices according to our standards. I want you to make sure that all work falls within acceptable guidelines. I want you to stop work that is not within our guidelines, and I want to make staff who are working on these things understand what sort of guidelines they need to adhere to. And finally, if any people look like they don't want to stick to our guidelines, I want you to make sure that these people are satisfactorily removed from the station. Satisfactorily to us or them. Both, if possible. If not, at least to us. If they're not pulling their weight or sticking to the rules, I want them gone. She said this in a fairly unemotional way, folding her hands together on the desk. Colonel Bartell was not a small woman, and not one who took nonsense either. And I'm meant to be doing this for 2 years? That's the standard employment period. However, I have the discretion to end it sooner than that. I fully expect this to be done within a few months. His hopes rose. And when that is completed, can I be posted to Ceres? After that, we will definitely look into that. And that was as close to a yes as he was ever going to get from her. He had also found that asking to be rejoined with his family was counterproductive with her. She would remind all her people that their first duty was to the military, and that begging for favors would not make anyone look good. He pushed away his anger over being given this position. While in a comfortable research station on Ceres, his wife was living by herself, and his daughter had started school, and he was missing all the important parts of her life. So here he was, Opus Station. Either he hadn't quite appreciated the meaning of the word dump, or wildly overestimated the conditions that came with the term. Fred's specialty was research management. Everything about the station was old. It functioned, barely, but there was no reserve capacity in case of failure, and station management didn't appear to have planned for any. Sections of the small station were empty and deemed unsafe for use, because air quality was not maintained. He was to share command of the takeover with an operations officer, who would look after the station's vitals in the residential sectors and all staff associated with them, and he would look after the research and development facilities. Commander Mariani was a very talkative man, as Fred found out when he first met him. Fred didn't mind him. He didn't like talking so much, but the other guy wouldn't shut up and didn't even notice that he was the only one doing the talking. He was quite entertaining. Like when they sat having dinner at a lonely table in a room designated officers' mess. You see, the Force never asked for this station. It fell into their hands when Lemura went broke. The Space Force wanted Lemura's Ceres operations, but they had no interest in the smaller stations. That's what we are, collateral damage. He laughed. Mind you, this place is such a mess that I'm surprised it maintains even 200 people. Is that all? Unless some of them are hiding somewhere. I wouldn't put hiding beyond some of the characters I met today, but let's be realistic and assume it's pretty hard to hide in a station this size. The roll of station workers is fully 201 people strong. I think at one time the station must have housed at least twice as many. It's never been very big, of course, but at one point there must have been some point to the existence of this place. That was what Fred was wondering about. Why had he been sent to this backwater? Why didn't the force just tow the whole lot to another settlement and attach it? Of course, that would still require the station to be made safe and sanitized. A 3-month period, he could survive that, even in the company of this talkative guy. He asked, "Have you found out how many of these people are actually working in research?" "There are 50. But that includes the guy who died last week." Yes, Fred had run into that story. Does the record say what he died of? Heart failure, being morbidly obese, kidney failure, diabetes, stuff like that. Of course, in a place like this, the medical facilities leave something to be desired, and in order to provide proper care, people have to actually agree to receive that care. Meaning? He was a stubborn guy. He knew he had health issues, but refused to leave the station for treatment. I heard all kinds of stories about the reason. Man, that guy's a rich source of gossip, if that's your thing. Gossip wasn't Fred's thing at all. Most gossip was just that. Cheap rubbish, untrue, innuendo spread by people who didn't like someone. He seems to have been very popular with the staff, though. Yes, he was. But the more popular someone was, the more vicious enemies they had. Chapter 5. The conference started the next day. When filing into the low-ceilinged mess hall for breakfast, Jonathan looked for Gaby in the surprisingly busy space, but she was sitting with the people they had met last night, including the straight-faced Rick Arbib. He didn't feel comfortable discussing Opus Station when those people were listening, so he just ate quickly and made some small talk. He looked around for the strange man who had spoken to him yesterday, but it was too busy. He went to his room, collected his pad for making notes for the program, and took the sideways elevator through the center of the space station to the conference center. The big hall was filling up quickly. After his talk with Ben the previous night, Jonathan did a quick head count of the lecture theatre and guessed that about 600 people were in the room. Come to think of it, that did seem to be a lot of people for an unsexy subject such as recycling. Most of them seemed to be quite young, which was also unusual. Somebody must have finally understood that these were important research areas. He found a spot about halfway up the sloping audience seating. As they filed into the hall, conference delegates came past a table where an assistant handed them their name badges. The table became increasingly empty the more people arrived, until, when the doors were closed and the first speech started, only one tag was left. Jonathan didn't think of it until Gaby said next to him, "What's the bet I'll get called in for help?" And she nodded at the tag. If that person isn't in the hall, they're probably sick. True. And she had registered for the conference as a medical officer with experience in emergency situations, because that was what the force required. If you're in a civilian situation where your skills may be of use, always list them so that authorities know about them. But the proceedings started without Gaby being called out. A prominent scientist in the field of health of close-based systems gave the opening address. Her name was Cleo Barr. Jonathan knew her from research papers but had never worked with her. She was a civilian, and as far as he knew, she did not do any work for the Space Force either. She spoke of how important their work was, and that the future of space exploration depended on them. Keeping the environment healthy and clean in space is a constant struggle that is the foundation for everything we do out here. If we can't breathe the air and we have nothing to eat, there is no us. She was preaching to the converted, although there were some students at the very back of the room who might be inspired to choose a career in recycling and habitat science. She even appealed directly to them. You will be needed. You will find demand for your skills. You will find it rewarding. It was all very strange. In the past, those subject matters had often been easily dismissed as merely a problem of chemistry and biology, which were well understood sciences. It was just that managing a whole system and keeping it healthy long term was hard. But it was indeed good to see so many new faces and to know that people finally took the discipline seriously. Maybe the whole situation with Johnson Base on the moon had been one mishap too many. When the organizer announced a short break after the opening address, Jonathan heard many optimistic voices. Mostly these were young people and even students, and he only wished that there had been the same emphasis on the discipline of space biology when he finished university. Then so many of his friends from university would not have needed to work jobs in retail and restaurants that had nothing to do with their training. Walking out of the hall on the way to the refreshments being served in the foyer, he came past the registration table with a single name tag. The tag said, Mark Stevens, the guy who had spoken to him last night. Well, that was interesting. Does anyone know who this person is? Jonathan asked some random people near him. Never heard of him, an older man said. He was in an auxiliary division uniform. No, a woman said. She was perhaps in her 30s and not in the military. He took a cup of tea and mingled casually with the conference attendees. While he walked from group to group, he asked a few people if they knew who Mark Stevens was. No one did. So he was curious. Jonathan checked the program for the conference but did not see Mark Stevens mentioned as a speaker. He was, however, on the attendance list, and he had been there yesterday. The next talk was about the use of the Corrigan cycle in the recycling process and how plants with Corrigan cycles would be rolled out to many settlements. The speaker, someone from one of the moon bases, went on to explain it in detail. Jonathan had worked extensively with the Corrigan recycling principle and found himself bored. He used the time to check on who Mark Stevens was, only to find that there was no information about anyone by that name, not in the conference summary and not in the research field in general. His name was on the attendance list, that was all. Maybe he was from a government agency and did not usually work in the field. But weren't those people listed on employee databases that would have come up in his search? As if he could find out from here who still worked at the Quarantine Authority office at the orbital launch station that sat in Earth orbit. At lunchtime, he went past the conference administration desk. Excuse me, I had a message to see a person named Mark Stevens. It appears he's not here, or at least his tag hasn't been collected. Do you know where he is or how I can contact him? The student who manned the desk looked through his files. I don't know who he is or what he looks like, but he definitely arrived here and collected his welcome pack. He gave Jonathan a room number. He would have to check this out later, when the day's proceedings finished and when he came back to the residential sector. The conference was set in a separate part of the dumbbell-shaped station, attached as counterweight to the other side by a thin tube. One needed to catch the sideways lift to get from one side to the other. A number of the station's walls were transparent, so that from the foyer of the conference hall you could see down the tube to the other part of the station and space beyond. It was pretty. Doesn't it surprise you that there is so much focus on recycling at this event? Jonathan asked Gaby when they both stood looking at the view. Somebody there must have made a decision that it's really important, Gaby said. I don't quite understand why that has happened, though, Jonathan said. Normally, when the force makes a change in direction, they put out lots of public notifications that they're doing so, and reasons. Wouldn't the reasons speak for themselves? We've now had a couple of scares where a closed environment was almost brought down by an infection taken in from outside. You would think they would try to avoid similar situations. But I haven't seen a change in policies, Jonathan insisted. It's a political event. Normally there is lots of communications, and I've seen none. Gaby said nothing for a while. The frown came over her face as it did when she was thinking. Jonathan wondered if she knew how pretty she looked when she did that. He also wondered how he could ever tell her this, because they had been working together for so long, it would be almost embarrassing to admit to feeling attracted to her for all this time and never having done anything about it. And he had a feeling that she was slipping away through his inaction. I'm wondering if it has anything to do with the talk of setting up a barrier zone around the asteroid belt, Gaby said. You're talking about an attack barrier? Jonathan said. I've heard a number of people talk about it last night. I haven't heard that. They're very insistent about the existence of an alien threat, and they want to stop it here before it comes into the inner system. Was that Rick talking? It annoyed him that he even thought this. He trusted Gaby to agree with him and see his point of view, not parrot some dressed-up monkey. Last night I had a look into the information about Opus Station, he said. The official report just mentions catastrophic loss of atmosphere as the reason for the demise of the station, not a single word about aliens. We have no idea what's really going on in the upper command. They may well have information that we don't. I'm sure they do, but I'm equally sure that if the information was important, we would all know about it, especially us, since we're here, with the job we're about to start. All these stations on this side of the belt belong to Lemura, including the doomed Opus Station. Putting aside the mystery of what happened to that station, Sector Command has said nothing about what they intend to do with the stations or why they acquired them. They are so convinced that they need to protect us against aliens, but they have been unable to provide any solid evidence that alien ships or just remotely civilized aliens actually exist. This sort of stuff made Jonathan really angry. Maybe it was his father's rebellious streak, but he didn't believe half-assed arguments and statements without proof. He had studied astrobiology, for crying out loud. Certainly, alien life forms fell squarely under that discipline. Vague images enlarged to the point of extreme blurriness did not. Pictures of dead space stations with no sign of battle damage did not. If there were aliens, he, with his knowledge, would be one of the first to know. Chapter 6. Tara spent the rest of the day in Ken's office because there was no way she was going to let this jerk get his hands on all the work they had done in here. It kind of felt like sacrilege going through all those familiar books and knickknacks. Personal items too, although Ken had not exactly been a family man. After his sudden death, people at the station were unable to contact any of his relatives. He'd never spoken about them, and no one was sure if any of them were still alive. It was so strange to be packing up this room, where just a few days ago Ken had still been sitting, laughing and telling jokes. Tara stacked the books that she took off the shelves and filled 2 boxes with all the models and drawings. She was pretty sure that Freddy the Frog was not going to need them. Ken had done quite a bit of work that was non-standard. That was why he was so brilliant, because he thought of new ways of doing things. She felt a bit less comfortable about all of his notes. A lot of those were electronic, and they were accessible only to lab staff. She had Ken's password, because she knew where he kept the passwords. Would Freddy ask to have it? She hoped not, because she would much rather give him only the information about the regular experiments, the breeding trials, and the nutritional value measurements. If she showed him Ken's other trials, he would think that Ken was crazy. Many of Ken's off-station peers said that. Or he would take the material and present it as his own. In the oldest depths of the data folders, Tara found reports on the strangest things she did not expect anyone like Ken to have. What would he want with a report from the ice rings of Saturn, for example? Ken was a biologist. But she stored everything that was not related to the official trials separately anyway, not in the main area where a frog face was going to find it, but in her personal research files. If Ken thought there was a point in having this material, she trusted that there probably was. She didn't notice that, as she was working, both Ashley and Dominique, the other girl who worked in the lab, had left. It was the change in shift, and they would be going to the cabins and to dinner. But all of a sudden she turned around in the lab and found that she was alone, and it was time to go to her room. She had completely forgotten to look at the plants in the lab. Before she left, she cast a look through the tiny window in the door to the experiment room. The room on the other side was filled with metal racks that held trays with tubes containing plants. Normally, the banks of lights above each tray would spread a warm glow through the room, but it was so late that the room had moved into its dusk cycle and was preparing for night. But a blue-green glow spread through the room from the very end of one of the aisles. It appeared to come from one of the trays. Tara checked the room's map, but it confirmed what she already knew, because of the position of the trays. These were the mushrooms from Ken's private trials. And she had never seen them glow like this before. Why was that? Tara went to the suiting room and put on all the gear to go into the infection control room. First the overalls, then the hood, the shoes, the helmet, and then the gloves. She had never liked working in the suit because it was hot and smelled on the inside. With that done, she went in through the hermetically sealed double doors. It was much cooler in the greenhouse, and the humidity made her visor fog up. Another reminder that she didn't like to work here. Yes, these were definitely the mushrooms from Ken's private trials. The mushrooms in question were of a type that had been grown inside the orbital launch station. Most of her samples came from there, and a long time before that, they were harvested from the forests of Russia and Norway. They were kept in the orbital launch station for several generations before being passed on to other facilities to make sure they carried no infections from Earth. These particular ones were quite tall and had nice, even caps. They had been part of her experiment for quite some time, but this was the first time she had seen this phenomenon. Some of them glowed all over, and others only from under their hoods. That was where the spores were formed, and those spores made new fungal threads in the soil from which new mushrooms would grow. The spores were tiny, and a small breeze of air could take them anywhere, even outside the supposedly hermetically sealed room. Before she started working at Opus Station, Tara had studied astrobiology on Mars. She had been there when there was a problem with contamination of the water plant. She might have been doing controversial research here at Opus Station, and might not like to show Frogface Ken's work, but she was not crazy. She knew the risks of contamination, and this was a strange thing. It made her uneasy. In theory, these plants and mushrooms were meant to be cleaner than all the others, because they had been exposed to a vacuum. This was part of Ken's experimental method, not only to make sure that there was no necessity for treating agricultural rooms with pesticides, but to increase the hygiene of the crops as well. But there was no way, even if these mushrooms were part of Ken's work, and even if she held them dear to her heart, that she could be silent about this. She would have to raise it with Freddy the Frog. Chapter 7. When the conference proceedings had finished for the day, Jonathan and Gaby went to look for the elusive Mark Stevens. He had a room not far from Jonathan's, at the end of the B corridor. They knocked on the door, but got no reply. "It looks like our mysterious man is not home," Jonathan said. "What do we do now?" Gaby asked. "We'll try to go in anyway," Jonathan said, and he tried the door handle. None of the doors had deadlocks, and he was only a little bit surprised that it opened. He was a lot more surprised at the state of the room on the other side. The bed had been slept in, the sheets and blankets thrown back, The pillow ruffled. The suitcase was on the floor, with shirts and trousers and socks spilling out. There was a collection of devices on the small desk in the corner, and the cupboard was open, with 2 pairs of shoes just thrown in. "This doesn't look like a regulation military room," Gaby said. No, it didn't. Jonathan would have been surprised at the state of this room for a successful civilian scientist, but because the man he was after was military, or ex-military, the mess was even more of a surprise. Why would he leave the place like this? Gaby said. It could be that the room was searched. Gaby studied a pad on the desk. Would they have left these devices strewn about? It depends on what they were looking for. Well, whatever this Mark Stevens is, he's certainly a mystery. That was definitely true. Jonathan went into the room and idly poked at some of the heaps of clothing with the tip of his shoe. The devices on the desk were a PCD and a small pad, as well as a charging station. He wondered if any of them were charged and on standby. He touched the screen of the pad and it came to life. It showed a very generic menu of choices. From memory, this was how the devices came out of the box. "This pad is brand new," he said, "possibly acquired for this trip." Gaby looked over his shoulder as he tried several options, but nothing was personalized on this device. The news was all generic, the music was generic, and no personalized info had been added. "Try the link that says Documents," Gaby said. Jonathan did. It came up with a very short list of files that did look more personalized. The first one was called simply Documentation. The next one said Diagrams, and one said Presentation. Jonathan said, I didn't know he was going to present anything. In fact, he was pretty certain that the name was not on the list of speakers because the name would have shown up in his search. Maybe he changed his mind, or maybe he prepared a presentation just in case, so that he could give it if they allowed him, but the program was already full. That was possible, but it was very strange nevertheless. Jonathan opened that file. It came up with a graphic representation of a small research space station that he was unfamiliar with, but the caption marked it as Opus Station. He turned to Gaby. "I think we found what we were after. He's come here under a false name. His name is not Mark Stevens, it's Fred Wilkins." And Fred Wilkins was, or had been, a military officer, hence that familiar military look about him. Jonathan flicked to the second screen of the presentation. It said, "The catastrophic failure of the habitat of Opus Station led to the deaths of 200 people, but it had much worse implications. The Space Force and the governments of Earth don't want you to know what I'm going to show you in this presentation." Gaby said, "Holy crap. He's probably been barred from giving this presentation." Gaby said, "Copy it. I want to get out of here. I don't like the thought of getting caught in here if he's gone missing. Who knows what's going on and why the organizers didn't allow it, or why he's not here." Jonathan did that, and yes, he agreed with her. Something was very smelly about this situation, and he didn't want to stay here any longer than necessary. And besides, they needed to get ready for the conference dinner. The conference dinner was held in the foyer of the conference hall, and they needed to go back to their rooms in order to get dressed up for it. It was a formal civilian event, meaning that there were to be no uniforms worn to increase the level of integration between military and civilian researchers. Jonathan didn't like dressing up very much. He liked the simplicity of wearing a uniform every day. You didn't have to think about what to wear, but Gaby had told him to bring at least a nice suit or matching trousers and a shirt for the dinner. So he went to get changed, drew a comb through his hair, shaved, and then waited outside Gaby's room until she was ready. And waited, while Gaby did whatever women did when they got ready for an event. Then the door opened. The woman who came out into the hallway didn't look like Gaby. She had transformed into a veritable princess. She had put her dark hair up. She was wearing dangling, glittering earrings and a dark dress that hung half off her shoulders. A necklace with a hanger in the shape of Saturn completed the picture. He felt the heat rising to his cheeks. "You look amazing." "You think so?" She turned around and watched herself in the mirror across the room through the open door. "I think I should have gone to the hairdresser's before coming here. It was really hard to get my hair to stay up because it's so long." She patted the back of her head, where her hair was held in a bun, with the aid of pins and hairspray. "I say you look amazing. I should ask you out." "Well, why don't you?" "We're already going out." "But that doesn't mean you can't ask me." She smiled at him. Jonathan's face grew even hotter. He searched his mind for things to say. He should say something like, "Princess, would you come to the ball with me?" But that would sound corny and stupid. To simply ask her whether she would want to come to the conference dinner with him was just dumb. He searched his mind for something witty to say, and no doubt he could have found a lame, witty comment for anyone else, except Gaby. Because about Gaby, he was deadly serious and didn't want to get things wrong. So the occasion went past, and he didn't ask her anything. It was a mistake, and he knew it. She shut the door to her room, and they walked down the hallway to the lift foyer and took the sometimes up, sometimes sideways and weightless, and sometimes down lift in awkward silence. Gaby even managed to keep her dress in place in weightlessness. And he had to say something, so he spoke about work again, and then about the disappearance of Mark Stevens. "So, how much do you think the organizers know about this person? When I asked the student at reception, she seemed to know him. Now we find out he's really Fred Wilkins under a false name. What's going on? Opus was an ex-Lemura station. Most of the stations in this area were ex-Lemura. We still don't know what the Space Force wants with him. Space Force retired him, but he's still quite young. He clearly has a story to tell that he doesn't think is being heard. Space Force doesn't want him to tell his story. Can you smell trouble in a Fred Wilkins-shaped package? We could just not get involved." "Yes, but he came to me asking for help. Do I deny help to him? That's not my style." "He could be nuts and full of weird conspiracy theories." "He could be. It's still not my style to dismiss him without hearing what he has to say." "I knew you'd say that." She smiled, and for a while it seemed like everything was all right. Chapter 8. Tara opened the door to the experiment room. At the very first glance, Fred knew what she had come to warn him about. The mushrooms that he had seen last night glowed with such radiance that the light in the room didn't even need to be on. It was an eerie blue-green glow that emanated from underneath their hoods. "I'm guessing this is not the desired effect." She had probably already picked up the fact that he was ignorant about crops and that there was no point in hiding it. He was an auxiliary systems engineer. "No, I saw it last night when I was still cleaning up the room." She glanced at the former manager's room, a bit awkwardly. The room was completely empty, with marks on the desk where equipment had stood, and on the walls where posters had been. The shelves were still dusty, and the floor bore scuff marks. He wondered what she had done with all the junk that had been on the shelves and the desk, and even the floor. "Why didn't you come to talk to me about this last night?" Her cheeks went red. "I wasn't sure if it was important enough. These mushrooms have some sort of contamination. We are in a closed environment, and you aren't sure if it wasn't important enough? Seriously, did these people call themselves biologists? Well, I figured no one else was going to come in here overnight." That was true. "But still, we are in a closed environment. Recycling is important. If this gets into the air ducts, who knows what it's going to do to the rest of the station, to our food supply." "This is a sealed environment. We have our own systems for the lab and the growing rooms." At least they had that much sense, and he should have checked that. Damn, what was he going to do about these electric mushrooms? The promise of a quick and easy job was slipping through his fingers. Fred dressed in safety gear, which consisted of a full hazard suit, helmet, gloves, and shoe covers. Underneath the helmet, he wore a face mask connected to a small tank for the supply of fresh, breathable air. Boy, it was hot in all this get-up. He opened the door to the lab and walked around the tables and racks, inspecting the trays with plants or mushrooms. The infection only affected the far right corner of the lab right now. One rack of trays with mushrooms had been reduced to a mess of luminescent slime. Another contained the mushrooms with the glowing hoods. "Did you treat them with anything?" His voice sounded muffled inside the helmet. It was cool inside the room, and his breath fogged against the inside of the visor. "No." Tara had come in after him, but she also wore a suit, and her voice came through the loudspeaker in his helmet. "Did you look at whether this species of mushroom is normally phosphorescent?" "I did. It isn't." "Did you notice anything else unusual?" "I didn't." "Have you seen this before anywhere?" "No." "Did you bring anything into this room that could have caused this?" "We normally dress like this when we go inside, for fear of contamination. The only way out of that room is a hatch on the other side. It has another chamber, which we use for vacuum experiments." Vacuum experiments? What was that supposed to mean? That was not on the list of trials he'd been given. They were supposed to be looking at nutritional value or air cleansing properties of plants. Tara didn't say anything for a while, and didn't look at him. They were both wearing these awkward suits, so it was difficult to look at each other. "Vacuum experiments?" Fred repeated. "Well, the previous boss, Ken, had this idea that we might be able to grow plants in a vacuum. That's ridiculous. Why would he think that?" "I know it sounds stupid, but there are some papers where people have, either on purpose or accidentally, exposed plants or seeds to a hard vacuum. They don't die as quick as people would think. In fact, some of the plants are hard to kill. It was his idea to breed plants that would be resistant to regular exposure to a vacuum, so that we could eliminate the need for pesticides inside the stations and all the problems that it causes. With modifications, we could even grow plants outside the shell of the station." That was an interesting thought. "How would you do that?" Ken developed a model based on a rolling cover that would provide the plants with the nutrients they needed, which would service each part of the crop for a short period every day. He had no idea if this was even possible, but some of the publicly available data suggested that it was not as crazy as it sounds. Space is always at a premium in closed environments. One would think that an agriculture plant is a way of cleansing the air, but in smaller environments, it turns out often just the opposite. So, if you have a small space station and could grow plants on the outside of the ship, then not only would they be free of disease, they would be out of the way as well. Clearly, she felt quite passionate about this idea because her cheeks went red as she spoke. "Ken developed these special heat pads. Heat dissipates very slowly in space because there is nothing to lose heat to. So if you just heat the roots and the direct environment of the plants, then you can grow them outside." "But what about air? What about light? You can use sunlight, but usually it would be far too bright, and the rest of the time there wouldn't be enough of it." "You can put lights and filters. I'll go to the other lab and show you the things that he had designed." And so they left the isolation chamber, after taking all the gear back off, and went into the lab. Here Tara showed him a number of conceptual designs, where the entire outer skin of the spacecraft would be covered in plants. To be honest, it was all so ridiculous that Fred could hardly imagine it working. "I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around this. What's the basis for this research?" She showed him a couple of papers that had been done many years ago in lower Earth orbit, where people had exposed seedlings to a vacuum and found that few of them died. "I'll read that. However, you're here to research the nutritional value of these mushrooms. and to improve the crop yield of these other crops. I want you to work on those projects, and I want you to take some samples of those glowing mushrooms and analyze them, especially for microbial content. I want you to analyze a few. One from each table should do as a preliminary sample. Yes, all right. She went back to her desk. She sounded unhappy. I want you to understand that I would like to run an open shop. If there are any problems, I'd like you to let me know. We need to work together to bring this project to a full conclusion. There are no problems. Maybe not, but clearly she didn't like him and let that stand in the way of her dealings with him. Fred went into his newly cleaned office, and for most of the day watched Tara out of the corner of his eye. She worked hard, barely sitting down to have a meal. He reminded her that she was not allowed to eat in the lab for safety reasons. She left for a while after that. After Tara had left, Fred went through the stuff that she had removed from the office that still sat on the floor of the lab, and found some small-scale models of Ken's plans to put gardens on the outsides of spaceships. The plants would grow in trays, covered in flexible, transparent material that would rotate around the outside of the ship and pass underneath a vent that would blow a mixture of gases into the transparent envelope. The designs were pretty and nice handiwork, and the idea was interesting, but this sort of stuff belonged in a science fiction story. This had nothing to do with the purpose of the station. Fred looked at the results from Ken's previous vacuum experiments. While it was true plants could survive a short period in a vacuum, the notion that they could actively grow and thrive there was ridiculous. To his surprise, some of the plants, in particular carrots, held out for surprisingly long periods. He hated to think about the radioactive contents of the resulting crops, though, and went to hunt for any measurements of those. There were none, but in one of his note folders, Ken had made the observation that the plants grew in strange shapes. Well, yes, that was not surprising. But for a solution, Ken said that people could just get used to having plants having unusual shapes in space. After all, zero and low gravity environments caused plants to grow in different ways. Seriously, people in this place wasted precious time and resources on nonsense like this? It was all so ridiculous that Fred almost threw the lot into the recycling chute. A few factors stopped him. First, he was an engineer, not a scientist, by training, and had only risen in the ranks of the auxiliary division through chance. Scientists' minds operated in ways that his did not, even if he worked a lot with scientists in lab design. Second, if this experiment was going to cause any kind of problem, or if there would be any kind of inquiry about this, he would need to present evidence. He would do best not to tamper with it, or even to open it, because all opens of the files would be logged, and they would know that he had seen them. He made sure that Tara and Ashley had indeed discarded and incinerated all the material from the experiment lab, which they had, and then went to his room to have some quiet time before dinner. A message had arrived from Sophie with pictures of Leela going to school. His heart ached. Truth be told, he was sick of this migratory life, of the assumption that if you were in the military, you should always put duty before family. Yes, he understood it, and he even subscribed to the ethics, but there should be times when being in the military was just a job, and other times when there was a clear threat that all resources were called for. The level of constant alert was wearying, especially when it was unclear why it was necessary. He was afraid that when there really was an emergency, all the depth of response capacity would be exhausted. Anyway, Alert Level 3, the current level of operation, required that all personnel wore dress uniform for officer dinners. He and Mariani were the only officers on the station. Mariani had brought a few junior personnel, but Fred had just slotted into the position formerly occupied by Ken Ward. Resources were scarce on Opus Station. While the station's full capacity was 500, It only ran with a third of the full occupation, and the recycling processes were much scaled down. Bringing in too many new people would require preparation. So they faced each other in the room behind the command center they had designated the officers' mess, for a crew numbering 2 officers. They were both in regulation dress uniform, which was ridiculous when you really thought about it. But once you started thinking about how much procedure was ridiculous, that was the end of your sanity. Was he becoming jaded? Possibly. Considering that the station's occupation level was so low, the meals were quite decent. The vegetables were fresh, the protein cubes were of a pleasant consistency, and the cook even used herbs. Not much point spoiling people's moods with bad food, the young man said when Fred commented on it. There's much to spoil our mood already. No need to add to it. Fred made a mental note to commend this young man for a more lofty service, if he was amenable to signing up for the force. They're just trying to curry our favor, Mariani said when the young man had left. They know we're going to reorganize the station, possibly decommission it, and want to leave a good impression. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but I wonder what they're eating themselves and what they're saying behind our backs in the common rooms. Have you encountered much resistance? Fred asked. Not direct resistance, but a lot of questions, and many I can't answer. I've asked Patel to give us some details about what they want with the station and where they envisage the staff to go. Good luck with getting an answer. Patel kept things close to her chest. By the way, have you heard the staff talk about a plan to grow plants on the outside of the station to save space? To what? Mariani's eyes widened. Yeah, he couldn't believe it either. I'm sorry, I know it sounds ridiculous, but the manager of research, Ken Ward, apparently had some sort of scheme to make it work. I only heard that they were testing exposure of crops to the vacuum because of recurring pest and disease problems. That made a lot more sense, and in fact, Tara had mentioned that as one of the motivations. Wouldn't it have been easier to check where those problems are coming from? You would think so, but a smart button decided that you could kill pest organisms by exposing them to a vacuum so that they didn't have to use dangerous and expensive chemicals. I guess the operative word is expensive. Space is out there, it's free. Let's make it do the work for you, never mind the radiation. Pretty much, and it would have been nice if the tactic worked, but from what I've heard, the problems with crop infections only grew worse, because all the crops went through the same vacuum chamber and passed infections onto each other. The station manager told me she had a strong disagreement with Ken Ward about the program because she refused to allocate any further energy resources to it. Ward replied that they would all die from hunger because the station refused to sanitize the living areas where infections kept growing. I heard from several people that it was a pretty spectacular bust-up. After it, he went back to his quarters and died of a heart attack that evening. The poor woman was pretty upset. She said she didn't mean to stress him out that much and never even got to apologize for the argument. Did she suggest that she needed to apologize? I mean, not about him dying, but that she found out that she was wrong about the trials being the source of continued contamination. Well, she would have to have been wrong, right? Nothing can live in space, so the contamination had to come from within the station. That was right. Or was it? Chapter 9. When Jonathan and Gaby arrived at the other side of the station, a lot of people were already talking and mingling in the foyer. The organizers had brought pots with small trees and palms into the foyer. Collections of tables stored throughout the hall, filled with trays of food. Everybody looked so splendid. For once, it was decreed that the military people not wear uniforms, and the amount of color in a room was astonishing. Here was another wave of fashion that had gone by Jonathan while he was working. Apparently, color for men was in. He felt decidedly frumpy in his dark blue suit. It was probably a couple of years too old as well. He accepted a drink from the waiter to quell his nerves and unease. These types of events were not his thing. "Hey, Gaby!" Damn, Rick. In civilian clothes, he looked even more athletic and strong. He looked like he could easily lift Gaby in the air, turn a pirouette with her and sweep her off her feet. They even looked made for each other. Both had dark hair, both were athletic. Gaby greeted him, and while they talked, Jonathan looked at his pathetic reflection in the window. Beyond the transparent shell of the dome, the other half of the dumbbell-shaped station moved in and out of the sunlight, and in and out and in and out. It was quite hypnotizing. Gaby was still talking to Rick when he said, "They've got music over there. Do you want to dance?" "Sure," Gaby said, and she took off with Rick across the big space of the foyer. Jonathan turned around and looked over the proceedings. His glass was empty. He took a glass of something honey-colored off a tray, offered by a waiter, and downed it in a few gulps. It was sweet and strong. Several people were still talking in groups, and he wandered around until he found Ben and the others from the orbital launch station. All he could think about was how Rick had called the people who still worked there losers, and how the anger inside him grew. He talked about work, although he wasn't sure what he was going to do at Ceres. His supervisor had told him that there might be someone coming to the conference to talk to him and Gaby directly there, and brief them on the situation and work they were meant to be doing. It was very strange how everything in this area seemed to be subject to a lot of secrecy. Nobody really knew what Lemura had been doing in this area. They had been a company contracted by the Force to do work for them. Most of the project seemed to have been related to mining, so why they didn't get closer to the asteroid field was a mystery. It was not his area of expertise, however, and he wondered how much he would hear from the other conference delegates in the next couple of days. A lot of interesting talks were still scheduled, even if most of the delegates appeared to have been coming from elsewhere. Jonathan had lost sight of Gaby. Ben was talking about the changes at the orbital launch station, and Jonathan no longer knew any of the people he mentioned. To be honest, Jonathan was bored. He hated parties and he hated dressing up. He was wondering whether he should ask the conference organizers about Mark Stevens or Fred Wilkins. He could not see the man anywhere in the audience. The organization of the conference was in the hands of a small commercial company whose business was to organize communication opportunities between scientists from all different walks of life. Jonathan had been to a couple of their events, and they were usually well organized, and the best part about it was that civilian and military personnel were encouraged to attend. In general, the conferences were run without political agenda and were open to communication between all people working in certain areas. The main organizer for this conference was a woman called Gina Parley. Jonathan knew her, at least by name, because she had published a number of research papers and was known as a competent scientist. She was not presenting at this conference, being the main organizer. Jonathan found her seated at one of the tables with a couple of people from Mars. She was an elegant woman with curly grey hair and big, deep-set eyes. At first he introduced himself, and they spoke a bit about research that was being done at Ceres, where Jonathan was headed next. Then he asked her about her research and how it was going. They were all lovely, interesting pleasantries before Jonathan got to the main point of talking to her. "I have to admit to being curious about one of the conference's attendees. A man came to speak to me on my first night here. He said he wanted to talk to me in person, and then we were interrupted, and I suggested we meet later. He said that we'd be here for the next couple of days anyway, and we would use another occasion to get together. The problem is, I haven't seen him since, and he never collected his name badge this morning." She raised her thin eyebrows at him. "Did someone not collect their name badge? I'm sorry, but this kind of detail is covered by administration. You will have to ask them." "I already did. They said he was supposed to be here. I went to his room, and there was definitely luggage in his room, yet I haven't seen him since. That's strange. Do you know if he's presenting anything at the conference? He's not on the program, but in his room we found some notes for a talk he was clearly prepared to give. What's his name? Mark Stevens. The moment he mentioned the name, her eyes lit up briefly. She knew what he was talking about. I'm sorry, but it seems that one of the attendees had taken ill. We're currently arranging transport off the station. My colleague Gaby is a doctor. Maybe she can help? She gave him a hard and serious look. Bartell, I know that you have a bit of a rebellious streak, but I've been advised that the military considered this topic out of bounds. But he told me he wanted to give a presentation on the demise of Opus Station. Don't you think we should all know what happened there? If he thought it was so important to come here and beg me for my ear, aren't you concerned about the fact that he appears to have gone missing? Not missing, Mr. Bartell. I have been advised that he has been taken off the station and that he will not be giving his talk. I have also been advised that the matter is confidential and that I can't comment any more on what I do not know. They didn't tell me why he wasn't allowed to give his talk. I do know that they have humanity's best interests at heart and that anything they do is in the spirit of human safety. I don't know any more, and it's not that I like this kind of interference in what should be a free exchange of information. But you probably know better than I that there is no arguing with the force. Once they have made a decision, that's it. I'm just concerned about the man's health. He seemed quite upset and frightened when he spoke to me. I'm sorry, I really don't know more about it. You could ask the administration desk for information about his contact details. Thank you, I'll do that. He wondered what pressure Colonel Bartell had been giving her. She was a civilian. To have military officers bashing down the door would be quite intimidating. The conversation was over, and Jonathan was done with his party. He was hot in his suit, and he wanted to go back to his room. He didn't like parties and wanted to watch that presentation that Mark Stevens or Fred Wilkins had planned to give, without the approval of the military. He looked around for Gaby, but when he saw her, she was still in the company of Rick. While he had been worried about a missing scientist, she was out dancing. They were talking and laughing as if they were the best of friends. His cheeks grew hot. A little voice inside him said that she was allowed to enjoy herself. But on the other hand, he was too annoyed to be reasonable. He went up to her. She turned to him, smiling. Oh, there you are. I'm having more fun than I've had in years. Come on, join in the dancing. Jonathan met Rick's eyes. He bet he was having fun, with his hands on Gaby, and he knew those were stupid thoughts, but he couldn't help having them. The alcohol was muddling his thoughts. I'm tired. I want to go to sleep. He had been going to say something about the missing scientist, but this was not the time. Oh, that's such a pity. Well then, I'll see you tomorrow morning. Have fun. And he turned around and walked through the crowd. But he hadn't gone very far when someone tapped on his shoulder. He turned around. It was Gaby. What's going on? Nothing. I'm tired, okay? You have been behaving like a sulking teenager all day today. No, I haven't. Too late, he realized that his voice was quite loud, possibly also as a result of the brain fog from the alcohol. Some of the people around them turned to watch. Raised voices at a scientific conference was a most unusual occurrence. You're making a spectacle of yourself. Gaby grabbed him by the arm and pulled him in the direction of the lift foyer. There was no one in that area. She faced him in front of the lift doors. What have you been drinking? Nothing that you haven't. You're acting like a toddler. Is it because I was dancing with an old friend? You can dance with whomever you please. I don't own you. But that's just it, isn't it? I gave you the chance to ask me out, and all you could do is just stand there and stare at me. I've worked with you for more than a year now, and that's all you've done. You act like we're a thing, but then when something happens or there is a chance to get closer together, you just do nothing, as if you don't care. I do care. You don't even know how much. And then, because his eyes pricked, because he was bad at talking about personal things, and there was no way he could let her see him getting emotional, in case he had to admit he was jealous of Rick, he turned away to the lift. I'm going to bed, he said to the metal door. Suit yourself, I'm not here to mope. The lift door opened and Jonathan went in, all by himself. While the lift took him through the weightless bar that connected the two parts of the station, he watched himself in the metal wall of the lift, a tiny, scrawny, puny, unfit shrimp who had none of the dazzle and bravado that Rick had, none of the strong face and charismatic eyes. He didn't deserve anyone, least of all Gaby. Chapter 10. Tara did not want to destroy all of Ken's work. He had worked so hard for his plans and hoped so much he would have a big breakthrough. How happy would people be when they could grow plants on the outsides of spaceships, saving themselves the trouble of having to control pests and diseases which always plagued crops inside a closed environment. It was such an innovative idea. Ken wanted to help people. Tara wanted to help people, but it was as if other people and fate conspired against her. She was trained properly as a lab technician and knew and recognized the risk. Contamination was real and dangerous. They didn't know what they were dealing with or where it came from. Contamination was the scourge of this station, and no matter how well they cleaned everything, it just kept coming back. There was nothing to do but to destroy the experiment. So the next morning she came in early, went to the lab, and started putting the mushrooms in the incinerator. By now, most of them had collapsed into a heap of mush, many of them blackened and slimy. When Tara pulled the trays out of the shelving unit, however, the trays that held the growing medium were spun together with slimy threads. It was hard to pull the trays out, because the threads went up into the light fittings that hung over each tray. And while the mushrooms were clearly dead, little blue specks of light glowed inside the gelatinous substance of the threads. Whatever was that? Tara grabbed a sample jar and scooped some of the material up. It was surprisingly tough and stringy, even if the material was almost transparent. She had never seen anything like this before. She closed the lid and set the tube aside for later analysis. She also took samples of the remains of the mushrooms before tossing the mushrooms into the incinerator. It was with pain in her heart that she turned it on. Whatever had happened to those mushrooms, she would probably never know, and it was another part of Ken gone forever. By the time she could hear Ashley coming into the lab, Tara had finished cleaning up. She went to tend to the regular experiments and take her daily measurements. She took the trays from the shelf and put them into the dryer so that all the moisture could be sucked out, and she could grind up the samples and she could start analyzing them. She then went and looked at the carrots, and when she opened the temperature cupboard, she almost let out a squeal of surprise. The little plants that grew in the tubes glowed. They had acquired that same phosphorus and blue-green glow that had also laced the mushrooms. Was that some kind of infection or bacteria? What's that? A male voice said behind her. Sure enough, it was Mr. Fred the Frog. Has this strange phenomenon now spread to the whole room? I thought I told you to get rid of those mushrooms. I did. She was not crazy. Is this part of the secret experiment as well? This tray is, but the one over there is not. Whatever conclusion he wanted to draw from that. She didn't like his insinuation that Ken's experiments were the source of all this trouble. They didn't know what caused it, so let's not put blame. Then get rid of all of them. This experiment is now finished. Clean out the entire room. Tara did not protest. She knew he was right. Do you want me to get Ashley to help too? Yes, please. We need this entire room cleaned out and disinfected, and the lab as well. I want all the rubbish gone. And that was probably about the heap of equipment that still sat in the corner of the lab. Equipment that had been Ken's, and she had not yet found a place for. Yes, it was all very much within regulation, but he sure knew how to make it known what he thought of Ken's work. Tara called Ashley, and they spent most of the day cleaning out trays and putting the content into the incinerator. She hated to think of all the new material that they would have to fly in to replace all this. Normally, the organic material that resulted from the trials was recycled, and they used volcanic beads as potting mix, but they reused them too, after thoroughly cleaning them and exposing them to a vacuum. But all of that went out, and the incinerator was doing overtime. Meanwhile, Tara collected the last of the data from the trials. In between that and managing the incinerator, it was very frustrating. Whenever she had been away from the computer for a while, she would find that the program reset itself and that the data disappeared or went somewhere entirely nonsensical. "Are you having problems with your computer too?" she asked Ashley. "Yes, I was just going to ask you. It keeps moving the data that I've just entered. Yes, or deleting it altogether." At that moment, the lights flickered and went out. Tara sat in the darkness, where she could only see a few pinpricks of emergency lights that were still on. "Okay, that explains our computer problems." Ashley turned on the small light on her pad. Tara could see her getting up from her seat. "I think I'm going to visit operations to see what's going on. We can't do our work when they're having issues. Maybe we've drained all the power with our incinerating." The lights flickered and came back on, only to go back off again immediately. "Well, whatever, I'm still going," Ashley said. And she left the lab, shutting the door behind her. At that moment, something made a loud popping sound on the other side of the room. Chapter 11. Jonathan went back to his room, feeling sorry for himself. He knew he was stupid, and he knew it was only because alcohol went to his head and did funny things there, and the best thing he could do was ignore it. He took off the uncomfortable suit and his shoes, and the shirt that Gaby had made him buy, and flung it on top of his open suitcase. Then he went into the shower cubicles, where he perhaps spent a little bit more time than was warranted, drowning his sorrows. Worst of all, he knew that Gaby was right. He had behaved like a ridiculous teenager. When she asked him to ask him out, he should have said something witty and complimentary about her dress, or something like that. But he had just been so afraid of getting it wrong that it had paralyzed him into saying nothing. Was there still a way to apologize, or had she indefinitely taken off with a handsome soldier with a strong face and broad shoulders? The one who believed, hand on his heart, that aliens were coming to threaten humanity, and he was going to jump in his spaceship and fight the aliens on his white horse. He liked to think that Gaby wasn't as shallow as all that, but right now, rational thinking was not at the forefront of his mind. He felt like banging his head against the wall, and all of his dysfunctional family life came rushing back at him. His mother and her failed political career, his father having been sent home from working as a nuclear scientist with the Force, both moping at each other, not talking about their problems, neither wanting anything to do with him, palming him off on the other. Wasn't that the first thing his mother had said when Jonathan had told her he'd gotten into a study program for astrobiology? "You can go and live with your father," meaning, "get out of my life." He wasn't fit to build long-term relationships with anyone because no one in his life had ever shown him how to. He got out of the shower. In order to turn the station into a proper conference venue, the organizers had installed little cupboards with provisions in each room. Inside his, he found a couple of containers with various beverages. There was carrot beer and synthetic whiskey, as well as cheap artificial wine and mixes with reconstituted juice. Out of all of those, he judged the whiskey the least obnoxious. At least, That was mostly alcohol, which was just a chemical that could be produced artificially. He sat back on the bed with his feet up against the opposite wall and his pad on his lap so that he could watch the presentation Fred Wilkins had wanted to give. It opened with a slide he had already seen, telling the audience that he was about to reveal the real reason for the demise of Opus Station. Then the presentation cut to a movie clip looking into a lab from the view of a security camera near the ceiling. There were benches and testing equipment on the benches, and a desk with a computer against the back wall. A window on the other side of the room looked into a brightly lit greenhouse room. A woman came and sat down at the computer. After a minute or so, she got up and turned around to the benches. She looked at a rack of samples that stood on the bench. Then a second woman came in. She said, "Have you done next door?" "Yes, I did. It's all gone." The second woman left again, and the first woman leaned her elbows on the table and rested her head in her hands. Jonathan wondered what this was about. She was clearly distressed about something. There was some shouting out of the view of the camera, and then a crash of glass. The woman turned around sharply and grabbed onto the desk. All around her, pieces of paperwork were flying through the room in the direction of the greenhouse window. There had been a breach of the hull. Then she could no longer hold on. She flew to the side, her lab coat flapped. She crashed into the wall of the greenhouse against the closed door. The screen went dark. What the hell had caused that? Jonathan was suddenly all alert, the fuzziness from the alcohol gone from his brain. He flicked to the next screen. It said, "The authorities will say that Opus Station failed because of a breach of atmosphere. They will not tell you why this happened and what caused it. This presentation will make that clear." The next slide started with a list of a number of random events that happened during the first few days of Fred Wilkins's tenure at Opus Station. Events like mysteriously glowing plants and mushrooms, lights turning on and off, computers giving their own commands, and a very dramatic-looking breach of atmosphere, with a note that the female lab technician had survived at least that event. Since Fred was the only survivor of the disaster, Jonathan suspected that things were about to get worse. Next, a table came up with some diagrams and analysis. Samples from the glowing material taken during the first day that Fred had started at the station. It showed a table of the results of a chemical analysis of material from several plants and mushrooms, with a red circle around the level of phosphorus. Normal plant material contained less than 1% of phosphorus. This sample had almost 2%. That was definitely abnormally high. Most of the other trace elements were out of proportion, too. Did the plant show any effects of poisoning? Where did this come from? Jonathan went to the next slide. It consisted of several photos, each of them of a section of the laboratory, with glowing semi-transparent threads stringing between walls and tables, between walls and experiment trays, and across the ceiling and floor, linking the furniture and plants and computers. It said, "Overnight growth on the day after the hatch blowout." They had analyzed the slimy material and found that the chemical composition was virtually identical to that of the infected plants and mushrooms. The next slide was a photo of glowing threads in the dark. Then another table, one of the conductivity of the material. It said underneath, "Please note that some of these materials were artificially created after the fact, since all the original material was lost with the destruction of the station." The next slides showed an experimental setup where tiny pads and cables had been attached to infected plants. Below it said, "Through experimentation off-site, we were able to replicate the effect that computer data can be transferred through plant material when it's been infected with the slime." Then there were two slides, side by side, of bits of computer code that showed where certain parts of code were taken out and inserted in other programs. Underneath it said, The true software on the right and the recreated software on the left. Note the highlighted code, which allows for operating the light stations in the lab. The organism copied the code and repeated it elsewhere, causing the light to behave erratically. Jonathan moved to the next slide, but found there wasn't one. Clearly, the owner of this device was still working on the presentation that he was not going to be allowed to give. Why? Where was he? And why hadn't even Jonathan's superior said anything about this? Chapter 12. Phosphorus and mushrooms and computer programs that changed themselves. What was going to go wrong next? Fred had been looking at the results from the analysis that Tara had sent him, and he could see a lot of problems with his data. For one, if they did have some sort of contaminant in the lab, most of the experiments conducted in here would be invalid. The first priority should be to clean the place out and to make sure that they had no contaminants. But he was sure the staff wasn't going to like that. The plants, the mushrooms, and everything else in the lab still contained the ghost of the previous manager, Ken Ward. The staff hated him for the sole reason that he was not their favorite boss, and there was nothing he could do about it. He was already sick of this place, but if he wanted to get his post at the Ceres belt with his wife, he would have to do a good job by his superior. So he ordered Tara and Ashley to clear out all the experiments. But we have all these results, Tara protested. If we have some sort of contamination, we need to identify it, and we need to get rid of it before it can contaminate the entire lab. They weren't happy about it, but they started doing as he said, because they knew it was the right thing to do. Meanwhile, Fred made sure that he collected samples of whatever caused the strange glow to be sent for identification. He spoke to Mariani about isolating the air circulation system of the lab from the rest of the station, only to find that this could not reliably be done. Not only that, there was no point getting angry at Mariani about it, although someone certainly deserved a dose of anger. How could you design a station like that? If you had contamination, it would spread throughout the station. He collected all the samples from the glowing plants and the slimy threads in a sealed box and set it on a bench with a note not to touch it. Then he went to take a sample from the outside of the station. Like most space vessels, the station's maintenance facilities included sets of robotic arms that could be used to perform maintenance operations on the outside of the hull. He asked for those arms to pick up a piece of sterilized cloth and wipe it over the outside of the station wall and take it back inside. He then took this into the lab and added it to his sealed container. Even though he didn't work in science, he had studied it and knew how to set up a standard test environment for the presence of biological material from extraterrestrial samples. It was part of the safety training of all operations managers, and a test kit was part of the standard station outfit. Fred transferred the samples into a sealed cabinet and opened the sample jars with the cabinet's robotic arms. He then spread a small amount of material from the content of each jar into a sample dish containing growth media, placed the lids back on the dishes, and set them on the shelves in the cabinet. There. He was aware that Tara had been watching him from the corner of her eye. Apparently she and Ashley had complained to the regular crew that the Force had sent someone to manage them who knew nothing about science. With the sample setup completed, he went to the office and looked up potential causes of contamination, especially in cases where it had come from an external source. He found some papers on different types of contaminants, most notably from the orbital launch station, and from Johnson Base on the Moon, and from Mars, where they had problems with native bacteria invading the recycling systems. In case of the Moon, these were bacteria that had been brought there by comets long ago in water that lay frozen at the bottom of the craters of the Moon, covered by a thick layer of regolith that was disturbed when people started mining there. Were they dealing with another alien bacteria here? The tests would hopefully be conclusive. While he waited for the results, he had to make sure that the current contaminated experiments were all discarded and incinerated. He found that there was going to be a conference where everybody working on the health of closed ecosystems was going to be present, and so he registered for that. Meanwhile, the lab staff continued cleaning out the experiment chamber and the lab over the next few days. Fred checked his test samples every day, and not much seemed to be happening. He was glad about that, because for a moment he had feared that the contamination had come from outside, as it had on the Moon and Mars, and that harrowing case at the orbital launch station. Hopefully, this was only a false alarm. But on the third day, when he came into the lab in the morning, it turned out that his relief was misplaced, spectacularly so. The sample dishes in the cabinet had, there was no other word for it, exploded with slimy growth to the point where they were no longer visible, and the growth had pushed off the lids. Long semi-transparent threads of various thickness came out and wandered over the inside of the cabinet, tangling with the threads from other dishes and gathering around anything electronic. He stood there looking at the mess when Tara came in. "Holy crap," she whispered. "You can say that again." "What is that stuff?" "I think the same organism that grew out of the bottom of the experiment trays." "Where did you get this?" "From the outside of the station." Her eyes widened. "So you're saying that by opening the hatch to our plants, we introduced this thing into the lab?" "Seems like it." "So, how do we get this stuff out of here?" Her voice sounded horrified. The inevitable answer to that was to decontaminate everything yet again. Before they opened the cabinet, they took all the furniture and loose items and piled them against the walls in the corridor, including all electronic devices, because the organism appeared to like the warmth emanated by those. Not all of the electronics could be removed, and Fred personally taped over the screens and leads that remained exposed. Then they went in and opened the cabinet. By now, almost half the wall space inside was covered in the slimy threads, and you couldn't even see the sample dishes anymore. Removing the growth was hard work. The threads were slippery to grip in the awkward gloves, tough to break, and many had attached to the walls with sucker pads like ivy. Once the threads were gone, someone came with a disinfectant in a high-pressure blaster and cleaned the inside of the cabinet. The contaminated material went into the incinerator. Fred spent most of the evening writing up the report. Unfortunately, that was not the end of the story. Over the next few days, the lab workers continuing the cleanup or working on the samples from other rooms continued to have issues with their computers. Twice, the lights went out, but without cuts to the general power supply. The electric sliding door into the lab opened and closed several times without clear reason. Both Tara and Ashley complained a few times about losing data. Fred dismissed it as them being tired, but then Tara came to show him something. On screen, she had 2 images of computer code. "This is the one that is the correct code as we entered it. The other one has been altered, as you can see." She pointed out a bit of the code. "I did not write that. This seems to be some command for doing something based on an external input, like turning on and off the light. Have you run it past station operations? I'll do that now, but I just wanted to show you. I don't know what's going on, but I'm scared. I want to get out of here. I think this whole place is doomed." Tara left and Fred sat looking at the wall in his office. What she said made a lot of sense. He should get together with Mariani, and they should order the evacuation of the station until he could fix what was wrong. Evacuate the station just because of a few slimy threads? He would have to do a better job at justifying that course of action to his superiors, in particular Bartell, who was very keen on having this station. but something inside him felt bad about this. He remembered reading that in the cases of the orbital launch station and the moon, the same young scientist had helped solve the case. His name was Jonathan Bartell. He assumed this man would come to the conference that he had registered for, and he had every intention of asking for advice. But the next morning when he came into work, he knew that something was off as soon as he came through the door. The light did not come on. There was also an odd smell in the room, one he had associated with a lab, but which he now recognized as belonging to the slimy growths. But before he backed out of the room, he noticed blue-purple dots of light that moved against the back wall. He used the light on his pad to see into the lab, and the entire far end, where the computers were, had been covered in mucousy threads. His stomach churned. He used his pad to take photos. Now they would have to evacuate the station for sure. What's going on? Holy crap! Tara had arrived at the lab. She stood at the entrance, her hand clapped over her mouth. "Don't come any further," Fred said. So they went through the cleaning operation again. Fred went to speak to the station manager about infection. They had no problems in the rest of the station, but couldn't fully isolate the lab. Fred said, "Then turn off the air supply and we'll vacate the area." The reply was that he would have to raise that with Mariani. Fred did, but he got no direct reply because Mariani was just as new in the job as he was and needed to consult with other long-term staff, most of whom would be unlikely to see the problem. Fred was frustrated and went back to the lab, where Tara and Ashley were still cleaning up. Ashley was just coming out carrying a box. He heard the pop when he had his hand on the door handle. He saw the door move in its frame, and then the door buckled and was sucked into the lab. Fred grabbed the door frame as the air rushed past him through the lab, through the open door to the experiment room. He couldn't see the airlock in the experiment room from here, but he presumed it had opened. There was only one thing to do. He let go of the door frame and slid into the room on the rush of outgoing air. He ran across and scrambled for the door to the experiment room. He took it off the hook. It flew from its hands and slammed shut. The rush of air stopped. Phew. The window in the experiment room held, for now. First, closed the cargo hatch. With that done, he turned on the light. He expected to see more slimy threads, but there were none. Tara! She lay against the wall that separated the experiment room from the lab, bleeding from cuts of broken glass. The rush of air had slammed her against the closed greenhouse door with such force that she was barely conscious. "I'll take you to the hospital." He managed to get her to her feet. Tara was crying and saying she'd had enough of this place and its strange, unexpected disasters. Yes, he had, too. Chapter 13. Needless to say, Jonathan didn't sleep very well. He never did when he came to a new place, but now there were all the other things to think about. Also, the alcohol he had consumed made him feel hot. He tossed and turned, and his mind stewed over a number of things. In the first place, what was he going to say to Gaby tomorrow? He would have to apologize, but it would be so awkward. They were just colleagues, after all, and he didn't want to ruin their amicable, professional relationship. As if that wasn't bad enough, he worried about Fred Wilkins. If he had really been in such distress, as he had shown when he asked Jonathan for help, then he might be in a lot of trouble. Would people from the force really try to silence him by removing him from the station? He found that hard to believe. But he would have to investigate, and to that end, he would have to confront Colonel Bartell, who was going to show up at this conference to brief him on his upcoming project on Ceres. He knew nothing about her, other than that she was said to be a disciplinarian. Great. Jonathan didn't like conflict of any sort. He had seen enough of it when he had still lived at home with both his parents. His mother would make defensive comments when his father wasn't there, and then would make defensive comments when he was there, and occasionally they would have arguments over his head at the dinner table. The best conflict was one you didn't have. He slept for a bit, but his sleep was plagued with dreams of failing space stations. He was lost in dark, low-ceilinged corridors, feeling that at any moment the power could fail and he would be dead, floating around in space with no way of contacting anyone, and the next time someone discovered him would be 200 years later and he'd be frozen and all dried out. He got up earlier than usual and found Gaby sitting in the dingy canteen, clutching a cup of tea. A few other people were in the room, but no one who justified him joining them, so he got his tea and breakfast from the back of the room and sat down opposite her, with a feeling of dread coming over him. Couldn't sleep? She shook her head. This place is creepy. Yes, it was. The other side of the station is nice. Yes. And then they ate for a bit, not knowing what to say. Jonathan's head throbbed with a headache that he was developing, his own stupid fault for drinking too much. Finally, he looked up to her and said, "I'm sorry." At the same time, she said exactly the same thing. And they both laughed, awkwardly. "You're right," Jonathan said. "I did have too much to drink last night. But you know, I really don't enjoy. I just feel uptight and uneasy." It was a very... Gaby shrugged. "You didn't miss much after you left. There was no raunchy behavior and no dancing naked on the tables." They both laughed, because the sort of behavior she referred to was quite common at the orbital launch station and some of the larger ships. Now that finally an adequate supply of alcohol could be provided from Earth. "I watched that presentation," Jonathan said. And so they were back at work, the only thing that they could comfortably talk about, because everything else was just too hard. What was it about? Jonathan told her in a few sentences what he had seen last night, and also that the presentation wasn't finished, and that Gina had told him not to get involved. She definitely knew what it was about when I talked about it. And she said that I shouldn't get involved, and this was by the order of the military. And we are the military. We don't know. I have this feeling that when Bartell arrives here, we'll hear something about it. I received a message that she'll be here later this afternoon. Well, that was something, at least. They finished breakfast and got dressed for the day. The conference session started with a lecture about a new type of filter in recycling. It was an interesting subject, but halfway through the talk, some sort of commotion arose in the back of the room. People kept walking in and out of the lecture room. When Jonathan turned around, it turned out to be security. The speaker got a bit nervous, and eventually he stopped the talk at the point where questions would be asked. He said, "Excuse me, but is something going on that requires you to disturb the proceedings?" Now a security officer walked down the stairs to the front. He turned to face the crowd. "I would ask the attendees to please remain seated for an announcement." People looked around, raising eyebrows at each other. The second officer with a pad joined him. Some talk broke out in the audience, people wondering what was going on. The officer with a pad began. "We have to report on an unfortunate situation. One of the conference's attendees had... We are currently looking at security footage of the area around his room and will be asking the residents a few questions. You do not have to comply, but you would be most advised to do so, especially if you have seen any suspicious activity." Gaby said, "What's the bet? This is about Fred Wilkins." "I'm sure we'll be asked." He was right about that. An officer was already coming in their direction. Chapter 14. When Tara woke up, she found herself alone on a hard bed in a bare room in the Opus Station Medical Center. The walls and floor were made from metal, and the room contained no furniture except her bed and the trolley that held the heart rate monitor. A curtain of clear plastic covered the door. She knew the signs. It was an isolation tent. She wore a thin hospital gown. Her right arm was bandaged, and there was a patch stuck to the side of her forehead. She was attached to a machine, which was measuring heartbeat and other things that such machines normally measured. What had happened? She vaguely remembered being flung across the room, thinking she was going to die. The airlock hatch had opened, while the inner door was still open, sucking out the atmosphere. How come she wasn't dead? Why had the hatch opened? Where was everyone? She lifted her head. "Hello, is anyone there?" A voice came from somewhere in the ceiling. "Yes, I am seeing you, although you probably can't see me." Tara looked around and spotted a dark-colored window in one of the walls. "You're watching me from in there?" "Yes, I'm here. We will keep you in isolation for a while. Please let us know if you need anything. The robots in the room will bring it to you." Tara found a wall panel that looked like it could open, from which food would probably be dispensed. Next to it, a screen flickered into life with the station's old Lemura logo. It hadn't yet been changed to reflect the station's new ownership. "How long have I been here?" 2 days. You're lucky. Lieutenant Wilkins managed to shut the door just in time, because otherwise you'd have been sucked out into space." Tara vaguely remembered a big crash and hitting the wall between the lab and the experiment room. She did not remember Fred. The voice continued. "The entertainment channels are all available to you, and please let us know if you need anything else. Food will be served shortly." Tara flicked through the entertainment channels, already bored. She was looking for news, but the news they got at the station was heavily filtered through the various services, and the company never had the resources to keep a journalist on staff for each of its stations. Consequently, the news was all about things that happened elsewhere. Tara wanted to know what was happening to the station. She wanted to know what had caused the hatch to open and why she needed to be in isolation. She asked the faceless person behind the dark window, "Excuse me, can you tell me what happened?" "There was a breach in the hull, but I don't know any more than that. Your superior will be coming to visit you soon, so you can ask him." Superior, her ass. Did that mean that Fred was going to see her in this flimsy garment? He would probably berate her for having left the hatch open or something stupid like that. She could still see the strange line of characters creeping over her computer screen. She could still see the lights go on and off and on and off again. She could still see the strange threads growing out of the computers and the little lights travelling along them. Anyway, all that should by now have been destroyed, but the question was, why had the hatch opened? The panel door opened and the robotic arm came out, but instead of dinner, it carried a syringe. "Hey, what's going on? You said there would be dinner." "The robot will serve you dinner." "It's got a syringe. What's in it?" There was a short silence. The arm stopped moving, and then, "I don't know." This was followed by the sounds of discussion between the nurse and someone else in the room out there that Tara couldn't see. But meanwhile the robotic arm started moving again, and she still didn't know what was in that syringe. She didn't trust it. Tara climbed out of the bed. "You can stay in bed. Dinner will come to you." "I want to know what's in that syringe. I want to know what it's doing to me." There was some more discussion that she wasn't meant to hear. Someone in the room said, "Stop the process now." And the nurse said, "It's not responding." The robotic arm was still coming at her. Tara was attached to a drip stand, and she wheeled it to the side of the room. Then she pushed aside the plastic covering on the door. When she touched the door handle, an alarm started blaring and an orange light flashing above the door. The nurse said, "Stay inside the room." "But that thing is trying to do something to me." She could see the line of numbers going across the screen now, and she knew that whatever had infected the lab had not been incinerated. It was right there, in the computer. "We need to get out of here. We need to evacuate." She opened the door, but was met by 2 male nurses who grabbed her by the arms. One said, "Stay inside the room, please. You have not been properly decontaminated." "There is no point. All of the computer systems are infected, too. It was the computer virus that opened the hatch. It's over there on that screen." She turned to the screen in her room, but it had gone back to its normal state. "Go back into your room, please. Dinner will be served shortly." The nurses pushed Tara back into the room. They folded the robotic arm back into the wall panel. She sat on the bed, looking for clothes. She had to get out of here. She had to warn Fred, or anyone else who would listen to her. He had seen what the computer virus did. She had a bit of hope that he wouldn't dismiss her story out of hand. He was actually a lot nicer than she thought he had been when she first met him. But then she heard a familiar voice outside the room. "I just want to see her to check if she's all right." It was Fred, sounding genuinely concerned about her. "Let me into the room. I just want to speak with her very briefly." "Would you see Lieutenant Wilkins in your room?" the nurse asked her. "Yes, please let him in. I have important things to tell him." Chapter 15. "We would like to speak to you," the officer said. "I take it this is about Fred Wilkins?" "Just come with us, please." Jonathan got up and followed the officers through the hall. Gaby came as well, but they stopped her at the door into the foyer. "Only him, please." Jonathan turned to Gaby, wondering why this was necessary. He wanted her to come with him. She was part of his job, part of his life. But he said, "Just wait here, I'll be back soon." She nodded. So he went out with the officer, leaving Gaby behind. He knew it was a bad idea, but there was nothing he could do about it. Superior orders were superior orders, and they weren't always sensible, but disobeying, talking back or questioning was never a good idea. The man took him into a small room at the back of the conference room. Jonathan imagined that this room was for small gatherings, maybe preparing talks. There was a chair and a desk in the room and a projection panel on the wall, which was turned off. "Sit down." Jonathan sat, but the officers, all three of them, remained standing. Jonathan looked from one to the other with a distinct feeling of discomfort creeping over him. "So, what's this?" It looked more like an interrogation. "Where is Fred Wilkins?" "Why are you asking me that question? I've been looking for him, because he came to me and wanted to ask me some questions, and the next thing he's disappeared." "You are the only person in this building who knows that he is here." "That's not true. The organizers know. The man came to talk to me and introduced himself as Mark Stevens. I didn't know who he was until I put a few facts together. I have no idea why he wanted to come here under a false name, but he was in distress, so that's why I was looking for him." "What did he ask you?" "Nothing. He asked me if I would talk to him, and then we were interrupted by my colleague arriving." Seriously, what did they think he was up to? "You don't suspect me of hiding him?" But clearly they did, or at least they suspected him of something like that. All the officers were standing around him in somewhat threatening fashion. Jonathan was starting very much to dislike the situation. "Look, I don't know what you think I've done, but I know as little about this man as you do. If I knew where he was, why would I have been asking about him everywhere? Why don't you tell me what's going on?" "He's wanted for the spread of sensitive information." "Well, he hasn't spread any sensitive information to me. He was trying to talk to me about the destruction of Opus Station and why we should all know about it. And there had been something about slimy threads that could repeat bits of computer code and insert themselves into places where they didn't belong. That was sensitive information, not his to give." There was a knock on the door, and one of the officers went to see who it was. He spoke to someone at the door and came back. "Stay here, we'll be back soon." They all left the room. Alone in the room, Jonathan looked at the walls and ceiling, both of which were grey and white and very boring. He was annoyed. He wanted to go back to the conference and listen to the talks. He had no idea why he was here and why they were so hostile to him. He had no idea where Fred Wilkins was, and holding him here did not make him appear. But if Fred Wilkins had been under some sort of gag order, which he had chosen to ignore, and if someone in the force didn't want him to give his talk, why wouldn't they tell Jonathan the reason? Maybe they had even tried to detain Fred Wilkins to ban him from the conference. And now he'd escaped custody, which meant that was the reason for his distress, because Jonathan knew how frustrating and dangerous it could be to have important information and to be actively barred from sharing it. But why? And why didn't they tell him what the issue was and why Fred's information was so secret? For all Jonathan could see, this was not information anyone should keep from the public. As he sat there in that room feeling annoyed, the lights went off. All the other sounds that came with the operation of a space station, the slight background hum of whirring fans and other equipment, just stopped. It was deathly silent. It was pitch dark. A few voices sounded outside. Carefully, Jonathan got up from his seat. He turned to where he remembered the door being and shuffled across the floor with his hand outstretched until his fingers met the wall. In that darkness, all he could see was that slide where Fred Wilkins had intended to demonstrate how some organism that manifested as slimy threads copied bits of computer code into places where they didn't belong, causing automatic operations of the habitat to fail. He knew nothing of how Fred Wilkins had escaped, but he could guess what had happened at Opus Station. The organism had copied bits of code that turned off vital processes. Suddenly opening an airlock or quickly letting air into an unpressurized room could blow out an airlock or hatches. And all the damage to the station had been of that nature. Not only that, but if this was an organism, where had it come from? Lots of strange alien microbial life could be found in space. Jonathan had already encountered quite a bit of it, and by coming here, had Fred Wilkins spread the organism to this station. The darkness grew oppressive and stifling. Jonathan had to force himself to breathe slowly, not to listen for the bang that would precede the violent rush of air out of the station. The organism repeated commands. It randomly turned on and off lights. Opus Station had been doing experiments to expose plants and mushrooms to the vacuum of space. The organism had remembered the code to open the airlock because it had been there to watch it being opened. Jonathan slid his hands along the wall until he found the door. Very carefully he opened it and looked into the foyer. A few people walked around in the dark in little pools of light from their devices. The officers had left one of their group as guard outside the door, but he was talking to someone else down the hallway. Jonathan slipped out of the room, shutting the door behind him. Chapter 16. Fred entered Tara's hospital room, dressed in the awkward suit that made him feel hot. She sat on the bed with a bandage around her arm and a patch on her face, but otherwise looking well. That was a relief in the sea of bad news. She said, "It spread through the entire station." So she already knew. He nodded. She asked, "What are we going to do?" "Get out of here?" He had argued evacuation with Mariani, but the man refused to believe how serious this was. "Do you know how to?" "There are some escape pods at the docking area." He had studied the emergency procedures extensively. "I would like to take as many people as possible." "They'll all be infected." "If that's true, we're infected too." Fred met her eyes, and he knew the situation was hopeless. Space was full of alien bacteria. They attached to the outside of the ship, and they changed the electronics within. All they could do was get out of this place and warn other people not to come anywhere near it. She insisted, "We still have to go. The station is trying to kill us." He rummaged in the coverings of the infection suit, where he had hidden a vacuum suit liner. "Here, put that on." "A camera watches what I do in this room." She glanced at a dark window in the wall, but Fred had come prepared. He took out a piece of plastifilm and his tape and taped the film over the window. Someone outside the room started shouting. "Quickly," he said, while Tara was doing up the fastenings of the suit. She had yanked out a drip and some of the machines started to beep. They did indeed not have much time, because soon the alarms would bring all kinds of people into the room. Fred picked up the drip stand and detached the leads and the bag. The door burst open, and a couple of people in hazard suits came in. Fred charged at them, holding the drip stand horizontally at chest level. He charged into the people while Tara crawled underneath, and then he dropped the stand and slipped in between as well. During his life he had done a lot of martial arts, and he knew how to avoid people grab hold of him. They ran to the end of the hallway, turned left and climbed into the tube that led into the center of the station. They became lighter and lighter as weightlessness increased towards the center of the station. When they were near weightless, she turned into a side tube and entered the hub in the middle of the station, a round room with a couple of hatches on the sides. One of them said, "Emergency." But it was hard to figure out how to open the door. Tara couldn't do it, and Fred pushed her aside to try to negotiate the panel. Meanwhile, the people entered the tunnel after them. Just when the pursuers reached the area in the center of the station, Fred managed to open the door. 3 men in hazard suits burst into the area. "Go," Tara said. "I'll hold them off." "No, you go. I'm infected. They'll be afraid of touching me." That was true. And there were a lot more escape vehicles. Fred slipped into the escape hatch and settled into the pod. It was a small rocket-shaped vehicle with limited engine capacity and fuel, mainly to steer the craft. Most of the space inside was taken up by seats for 4 people and the space underneath for air tanks. Where was Tara? Through the open door into the pod, he could see part of the space outside. He couldn't see Tara anymore, only part of someone's leg, not moving. He called out, "Tara!" The only reply he got was the hissing of air out of the ceiling vents. He grew very afraid. Something was very wrong at the station. A number of Space Force ships were in the area. He should warn them. "I'll go and get help." He pulled the control panel of the pod towards him, shut the door, and launched the pod. At first, it had so much acceleration that he couldn't lift his head or even his hands. But then the acceleration slowed and he was able to use the controls. He turned on the outside screen, projected on the inside of the pod over his head. To his horror, he could only watch as the airlocks opened and air blew out, taking with it debris, furniture, equipment, and bodies. Fred pressed the emergency button. Whatever happened now, he was going to make sure that as many people knew about this menace as possible. A voice said in his ear, "Copy, Pod 342. What's the emergency?" Chapter 17. Jonathan ran through the foyer to the lifts. Because the conference was in full session, the lift foyer lay empty. He went into the lift, the doors closed, and it started moving, all much too slowly for his liking. He had no idea what was going on or why people were playing coy with him. He was an expert in alien contamination threats, and here was one, as clear as could be. A lot of other things suddenly made sense to him. Why Fred Wilkins had been secretive, why he'd come here under a false name, why he'd gone missing after contacting Jonathan. And now it looked like the Force had lost Wilkins in the station after detaining him earlier. They might know he had information to share that they didn't want known, but did they know about the organism that he might be spreading? He was going to find this man. The station wasn't very big, and he was likely to be somewhere. When the lift door opened, Jonathan ran in the direction of the accommodation rooms, using the light from his pad. He checked inside every door that would open, calling out for Fred Wilkins to come out. Most of the rooms were empty. He checked inside the bathrooms too, and the cupboards. The sounds of opening and closing doors were very loud in that silence. In his mind, he imagined Fred Wilkins hiding in a cupboard, too afraid to come out. He imagined the man dead on the floor with slimy threads growing all over him. It wouldn't be the first time that this had happened either. Damn, where was this man? Worse, was he, Jonathan, Now going to get the blame for being involved in his presence here? Halfway down the corridor, the overhead lights came back on and the air started hissing from the ceiling vents again. Phew, that was something, at least. He heard the distinct zoom of the lift and the opening of the doors. No, he probably should have warned the conference delegates not to come here. If there was an infection, it would be spread throughout the station. A couple of people came from the other direction. Jonathan recognized one of them, Colonel Bartell. Holy crap. There you are, Bartell. I heard you did a runner. Holy crap, holy crap. I'm very sorry, ma'am. The power went off and I realized something that would be of utmost importance to the safety of the station and all the visitors. The visitors have been most rattled by the power outage. It's about the power outage and the demise of Opus Station. She gave him a blank look. Jonathan couldn't gauge whether she was giving him her military poker face or truly didn't know what this was about. The former, he hoped. She nodded at him. I think it's time we had a frank talk about security. With a feeling of dread, Jonathan followed her into a room. It was one of the corridor common rooms, like the one where he had shared drinks on his first night here. All in all, this conference had been an unmitigated disaster, and he felt like an idiot. Of course, the Force had reasons to keep secrets as it did. Maybe he would even have been briefed on them if he hadn't kept running away. This is about the enemy, Colonel Bartell said. That was the least likely reply he expected to hear. She said, Does that surprise you? Yes, because, just to be honest with you, a lot of people question whether there even is an enemy, and definitely I would not expect to find any of them here, if an enemy in fact existed. Yes, I know that the common rooms and the mess halls are full of gossip, that we are supposed to inflate the risk of an enemy so that we can get more funding and other stuff like that. Heat crept to Jonathan's cheeks. But do you really know why we acquired these stations that were formerly in the hands of a small mining research company? And do you notice how I emphasize the word research? To be honest, that's a mystery. I assume that these stations came with another deal that was more important to the Force. No, Bartell, they were the focus of our acquisition. You actually wanted these dilapidated stations? We wanted to set up a research hub in this area. It's going to be of vital importance for our defense against the enemy. She left a few moments' silence for dramatic pause. You see, and I'm telling you that this is only for your ears, just for the sake of that rebellious streak of yours that seems to wriggle out of situations against protocol. Jonathan's face grew hot. I'm sorry. I'm sorry won't cut the mustard when we're all dead. Now you have me curious. What is this enemy that we are not supposed to know about? You see, it's an enemy unlike any, an enemy that the military is not designed to defend themselves against. It's an enemy that is everywhere. It's an enemy that uses tactics that cannot be fought with weapons. Jonathan was beginning to see where this was leading, and a cold feeling crept up in him. He should have known this. The enemy are all microorganisms, aren't they? That's correct. The further we have pushed into the edges of the solar system, the more ships have been plagued with strange diseases and conditions. Sometimes we've almost taken them back to Earth. Sometimes the organisms have died from exposure to too much sunlight or not enough nutrients. But whenever one dies, there are hundreds and thousands to take its place. That is the reality. Deep space is full of rapidly multiplying, rapidly evolving microorganisms that are waiting to kill us, and we need a defense against them. But why haven't you said anything about it earlier? Can you imagine the panic that would have caused on Earth? No, it's much easier pretending that we are out here fighting some bogey in spaceships that can be seen with the naked eye. than to let people think any particle of a breeze can be laced with something that's going to change humanity forever. She said nothing for a while, and he met her eyes. Whether he took what she said at face value or believed there was a political reason was immaterial. The horror of what she was saying was only beginning to sink in. His work at the orbital launch station and the moon were not isolated incidents. The prevalence of harmful bacteria was not so high out there because the power of sunlight, but that was the threat. Rapidly evolving bacteria everywhere, hungry for places to infect and grow. So, there you go. You now know a secret that maybe some people suspect, but few people know about officially. You were getting to the stage where you needed to know this anyway, but I expect that you will be required to keep silent about this. Also my partner? And because that sounded too intimate, he added, my work partner, she's a doctor, she'll understand. Was that a smile over her face? Ah, Dr. Gaby Larsen. Use your discretion, but impress upon her that this must not get out. You will in fact be commissioned to work on a project of utmost importance about fighting this menace. That is what I was meant to be doing at Ceres? That's correct. Actually, we already started some of these experiments. Let me guess, Ken Ward was working for you? A sharp look. You're not dumb, Mr. Bartell. He was an eccentric, to say the least, but that made him suitable to receive our funding. And this was another reason for the secrecy. If Lemura got wind of that, there might be legal consequences. At that moment, the lights went off again. Chapter 18. Fred was floating through space. It was dark and silent, and he could see very little. The pod had a tiny window, through which he could see a small piece of the star field. The sky was black, and the stars cold, white, unwavering. The clouds of debris that had blown from the station had disappeared from view long ago. He waited. He thought of what he needed to do next. Let as many people know as possible. Eventually, a male voice sounded in his helmet. Rescue ship to pod, are you there? He replied. I am. I'm not about to go anywhere. The man laughed. We're coming to pick you up. Good. I'm looking forward to that. Fred waited a lot more. Eventually, he could see a light through his window. It tracked across the star field and disappeared again, circling around. He said, I can see you. We can see you, too. It took another long while before the pod shook in a sudden movement of something hitting the outer surface. This was followed by the whine of the cable being pulled in. We've got you. A moment later, bright light flooded through the window in the pod, which landed on a metal surface with a soft bump, and someone opened the lid from the outside. A man looked in, wearing a full protection suit. Fred could not see his face through the visor, but a muffled voice came from within. Make your way across the hall into the doorway over there. He pointed a gloved hand. There was no gravity inside the ship, so Fred pushed himself out of the pod and floated across the hall to the doorway indicated. He ended up in a small room that had been completely covered with disinfectant film. At least they took the threat of infection seriously. A voice came through a loudspeaker somewhere behind the film. Someone will be with you shortly. Fred waited. He was keen to tell his story. After not too much time, another man in a suit appeared. He asked Fred questions about his health and his rank and identification number. Every time Fred tried to talk of the infection, he changed the subject. Fred got so frustrated that he shouted out, There are these organisms out there that change computer code, and all this stuff doesn't matter. You have to do something about it. It was very frustrating that he couldn't see the man's face. They took him to a room somewhere in the ship. They left him alone, although they provided him with some food. They allowed him to keep his pad. He tried to connect with the ship's systems, but couldn't. He shouted and banged on what looked like a one-way window where people were probably watching him. "Listen to me. There is an organism out there, probably on the outside of your ship, that will change your computer systems." There was no reply, and, with a feeling of dread, he wondered if those systems had already been affected. Eventually, a person showed up. This person also wore a suit, but through the movement, Fred thought this was a woman. She recorded his temperature and heart rate, and then took him to a medical facility where they finally allowed him out of the suit and washed down his entire body with smelly disinfectant. Fred tried again. "You can't clean this infection by washing me. It's in the computer systems." "Don't worry," she said. "We have everything under control." "I don't think you do. I don't think you understand how serious this is." "Someone will be here to debrief you later. You can mention your concerns to her." The person who finally turned up was Sector Division Head Colonel Bartell. She simply listened to his story, which gave him courage, because so far no one had done even that. He'd lost track of time inside this tin can. But after he finished his story, the only thing she said was, "You are hereby honorably discharged from the force. I believe you wanted to be reunited with your family. I will book your passage to Ceres as soon as I can." It was what he had always wanted, until he realized that he didn't want it. Not like this. "But what about all the things I've just told you?" "Thank you. We will consider your data." "Consider? This stuff kills. It's everywhere." "We are aware of the situation. You have been exposed to these organisms, and therefore you can't return to your position." But when she left the room, he realized that she had said nothing about what the force was going to do about preventing the infection entering other stations. He asked about Opus Station and heard that all crew had died. And he thought about Tara and Ashley and even Mariani and the young cook whom he had intended to recommend for promotion. He couldn't understand, for the life of him, why this wasn't big news. But he played along with it and said no more. He had a plan. He was still registered for the conference on the biology of closed systems. He would go there and show his material. Chapter 19. For a moment they sat in the dark silence. "They sure have an issue with the power supply," Colonel Bartell said in the darkness. "No," Jonathan said. "This is all part of the infection that he brought to the station." "What do you mean?" He was going to give a presentation about why the disaster at Opus Station happened. He had figures that showed that the microorganisms they picked up, possibly from the outside of the ship, were learning to copy bits of code into computer systems and randomly operate the station systems. Even though he's been cleaned, he appears to have brought the infection across. She swore. "How?" "We don't know until we find him and determine the nature of the organism. Then we have a problem that is bigger than we thought." "Excuse me, are you all right in there?" Someone opened the door, and one of the colonel's guards shone the light inside. "The lights went off outside. I wanted to check that you're all right." "Come in, sit down," Bartell said. The two officers did just that. In a few sentences, she explained to them what Jonathan had said, and then she turned to Jonathan. "Do you have any suggestions as to what we should do now?" "I'll need a schematic of the station, and I'll need to know where the major operation hubs are. If this organism is going to attack them, then we need to isolate them if we still can. Meanwhile, I want someone to set up emergency lighting and take all the conference delegates off the station." She snorted, "Spreading the infection even further." "Well, it's either that or get them all killed." "I agree, that would look messy." "We can deal with a quarantine of that ship later," Jonathan said. "I presume the shuttle is still in dock." "It is. Our own ship is only shadowing the station." "Which should mean it still has communication." "I would hope so. Any idea how to kill this thing?" "I don't think anyone at Opus Station had gotten to that level yet. They were still trying to figure out how to interpret their data." Jonathan was starting to have an idea. He said nothing because he wasn't sure yet, and the first priority was to get all the people on the other side of the station to safety, to get himself to safety, to make sure that military ship out there didn't become infected. Fear clamped a hand around his heart. It might already be too late. With the station in this configuration, there was probably an emergency cut off between the two halves of the dumbbell-shaped station. They might not know what happened at the other half. Power going off, airflows reversed and foul air entering the station, airlocks blowing out. What about Gaby? Would that have been the last time he saw her while having a stupid argument with her? He asked, "Is there any way you can get into contact with the people over on the other side?" "We can relay communication through our ship, unless it has been affected too." As it turned out, the ship had not been affected, but the communications officer on board was puzzled about the sudden dropping out of the signal from the station. That meant the power was off in the other half of the station too. Had he been in contact with anyone else? He hadn't. Was the station still intact and pressurized? It was. "Where are the power hubs?" Jonathan asked, breathing out heavily. "There is one on each side," said one of the officers. "Show me to the one in this half of the station. If Fred Wilkins was somewhere, he might be there, trying to fix the damage." He received the map. Both officers got up, and Jonathan followed them out the door, guided by the light from their pads. They went down the corridor and then up a set of stairs into the place Jonathan had not been before, and a corridor that was not lined with cabin doors. Instead, there were double doors with signs that said "Do not enter" and "High voltage area." The officers took him to the very end of this corridor, where they entered a small room where control bays took up all available space along 3 of the walls. Jonathan supposed that normally lights would flicker on these panels, but right now everything was dark. That was, except for a mass of slimy strands that expanded from the far corner of the room. Most of it sat at the place where the control panel met the wall. It looked like black gelatine, and faint blue lights pulsed within. "Holy crap," the first officer said. "You can say that again," the other said. "Look here." And he directed the light into a space underneath the panel. Hidden under the table in the corner of the room sat a man, with his back against the wall and his knees drawn up to his chest. His eyes, startling blue, looked over the top of his knees. Fred Wilkins. "Don't touch me," he said. "May I ask what you're doing here?" "Don't touch me," he said again. "You're wanted for escaping custody," one of the officers said. "It's all over the computer system." "Whatever are you talking about?" the officer said. "The infection. It's gone into the computer system. It's going to kill the station, same as it did Opus." "He's gone nuts. Nothing will kill the station. We're just having an issue with the power." "Let me talk to him," Jonathan said. The 2 officers backed out of the room. Jonathan kneeled in the doorway so that he could see Fred Wilkins's face. He realized that he had no environment suit and that it was probably too late for that anyway. "Tell me what's going on. I've seen the presentation you were preparing, but it's not finished, right?" "Jonathan Bartell?" He looked into Jonathan's light like a hunted animal caught in a spotlight. "Yes, it's me. I'm trying to make sense of what's happening." "Did they tell you that Opus Station was killed by infection?" "No one has been terribly specific about it," Jonathan said. "They've told us that the station was attacked and that the area is a restricted zone. They've called up troops." Fred laughed. "You can't fight this with weapons." "Privately, I've also been told that the real enemy is microorganisms that live in space. I believe a scientist at Opus Station was doing experiments with exposing plants to space. They have also started to employ a lot of new young scientists. That scientist brought the infection into the station. It started randomly interfering with the electronics and caused the systems of the station to malfunction. It was growing like slimy threads everywhere." I escaped and I assumed because I'd been disinfected there were no more slimy threads. The infection was gone, but I was wrong. It spreads through electronics, through my pad, as soon as I turned it on. Even though I had taken precautions, I was a carrier of the infection. I've just been trying to get rid of it. I turned it off and disconnected all the electronic processes that we can live without. And this was what he had been doing at the hub before they found him. Are you saying that you disabled many of the station's functions? I deleted things that had been infected. I was just trying to stop the spread. Holy crap. Why didn't you ask for help? It was too fast. The power went off before I could contact anyone. Jonathan restrained a curse. He went back into the corridor where the others were waiting with only a tiny light to conserve battery power. And, Colonel Patel said, I need all of the station systems and maintenance crew to report to me. I will relay that. She gave the order and then said, Bartell, what would you normally use to destroy an infection? You have a lot of experience with this. We can provide several biological agents from our ship. Just tell me what you need. There is no point. There is no organism that we can attack. It's in the computer systems. She stared at him. It's copying code and firing it up at inappropriate times. That's why Opus failed, because hatches and airlocks were opened at random that should never have been opened. If anyone has some sort of override to the systems of this station, ask them to activate it now. If we're without power for a few hours, it might get hot and stuffy, but we'll survive. At least nothing will open the airlock. Colonel Patel nodded to one of the officers. Chang, relay that to the ship and see if they can contact someone on the other side. Jonathan added, and I'm going to need a small computer or device that should be regarded as disposable. It will become infected. The other officer handed Jonathan his pad. Jonathan sat down on the ground, leaning his back against the wall, and turned the device on. The battery was half empty. He had 2 hours to fix this. Colonel Patel had her receiver on loudspeaker. A male voice aboard the military ship said, I spoke to the people in this station. They say their control room is infected with some kind of growth. They don't know if there is an override or whether they can access it. Damn it. Tell them to bolt the airlock shut by any means available, Jonathan said, while loading the information from Fred Wilkins's talk. Tell them to suit up and have air tanks ready. Tell them we might need to evacuate. Patel repeated that. If we bolt the airlocks, rescue missions can't come in either. The man in the ship said. Just for an hour, Jonathan said, and she relayed that as well. Heaven knew what he was going to do if he couldn't fix it in an hour. Worse, he realized that the passenger shuttle that was docked at the station, their only way off the station, might be compromised too. Chapter 20. There was too little time. The system people managed to restore limited power, enough for the lights and some computers to come back on. Jonathan hoped that they had those hatches and airlocks firmly closed. There was not enough power for the lift to operate. One of Patel's officers managed to restore power to at least some screens in the control room, but they all produced gibberish, which Jonathan copied and then sent to the system people on the other side. They were still relaying things through the ship, and it was very slow. The system's programmers said that the pieces of code Jonathan sent were simple commands to operate the lights and the air supply system. Is there any pattern to what they copy? Jonathan asked. Just general operational commands, really low-level stuff, the female programmer said. It's just the same as at Opus, Fred Wilkins said from the door. It's going to infect everything. As far as Jonathan could see, it had already infected everything. But then the military ship said, Someone wants to speak to you, Mr. Bartell. A female voice said, Jonathan? It was Gaby. His eyes misted over. How are you keeping up over there? It's pretty desperate. People are panicking. We don't know what to tell them. In a few sentences, Jonathan explained the situation. What do you think? Let me think about it for a while. We don't have a while. I have an hour or two before this device runs flat. It's the only usable computer we have here. If you're going to have any ideas, please come up with them now. She let a short silence lapse. Then she said, You're saying that this organism will multiply both through these slimy strands and through the computer systems. That seems to be the gist of it, yes. And when you get rid of the slimy strands, it will still multiply. It seems so. And that it copies parts of random bits of code to places where they shouldn't be, where they then result in unusual malfunctions and catastrophic actions by automated parts of the habitat. Basically, anything that can go wrong in this environment can kill us, even if the habitat malfunctions or if our safe cocoon gets punctured. Can't we turn off the automations and control the habitat systems manually? I've already told them to do that as far as possible, but I'm not sure we can shut out the level of intervention necessary. Every electronic device has at least a tiny chip that controls what it does. True. These bits of code, where do they come from? They're just parts of binary code that make the system work. There is nothing sinister or new to them. So this organism uses our own weapons to kill us. If you want to put it that way. Why don't we reverse the situation then? You mean use its weapons to kill it? Something like that. You could potentially make it copy certain things, things you wanted it to copy. Oh, I like that. Yes, not sure how we'll do it. That was the good thing about talking to Gaby. She always gave him ideas. But it would be hard to train the organism to copy exactly the bit of code he wanted to the place he wanted it, all within an hour. But what if... He said, I'll know what we'll do. Epidemiology. What does that have to do with it? This is a disease, so we'll treat it like one. Hundreds of years in the past, fledgling scientists discovered that if you inoculated people with weaker strands of a disease, or strains that didn't cause any symptoms, people would not get the virulent strain of the disease that killed them. Yes, I'm a doctor. I know the principles of vaccination. We are going to vaccinate the station against this threat. We're going to make the infection copy something useless. He went back to the systems administrator. Can you give me a piece of code with a function that moves data to a partition or separate system, or something like putting data in a holding queue? I have something like that, the woman at the other end said. We get routine communication, news updates and non-vital information sent to us all the time. We put it in a separate database that people with varying levels of authority can access. I can quickly adapt code for the information to go in there, but not attach any access codes. Is it very long? None of the snatches of copied code were very long. A few lines. Yes, that should work. Get that to me as soon as possible. Then Jonathan went back to the control room and found a plug to connect his pad to the main computer. What are you doing? Fred Wilkins asked. You're infecting your pad. It's infected us already. If I give this thing a place to go to where it's out of the way of the station's operations, it may go there and be harmless to us. And then, because future infections will recognize that this organism is already at work in the station, they won't infect it further. Would it work? It had to, because the alternative was just too terrible to contemplate. Jonathan got his code, but it turned out to be 12 lines. He went back to the woman at systems. It's too long. Is there anything in that code I don't absolutely need? Let me have a look at it. It was taking too long for his liking. He pulled out old-fashioned cables to connect his pad to the system. Fred Wilkins looked on silently, his eyes wide. The gelatinous mess on the control panels was growing visibly. Finally, the systems programmer gave him another piece of code. I've taken out the routines that set the authority parameters, she said. I hope this will still contain the contamination. I hope so, too. What's your name? Cora. I'm Jonathan. Thank you for your help. I guess if it works, we'll be speaking again soon. If it doesn't, he pressed copy. The code vanished from his screen. Jonathan held his breath while watching the screens in the control room. Lines of white text scrolled across several of the screens, too fast for him to see what they said. He waited and waited. He watched the blue lights in the gelatinous threads flicker on and off and on and off. What did it mean? What would he do if it didn't work? How quickly could they get military ships to turn up to rescue all those at the station? He had no doubt that ships were already underway. Would they be able to get everyone off before something catastrophic failed? Seeing as they couldn't use the airlock and would have to use a soft dock tube to get people out? If you weren't used to crawling through those things, it would take a while. He had to do this as part of his regular training updates, but the civilian scientists... One of the screens went blank. Jonathan held his breath. The station's Lemura logo came up. And then, the system has been restarted. Please enter your passcode. Jonathan did. The ceiling fans came on. All the blue lights in the slimy thread stopped blinking. I've got a partial restore of the system, Cora said. It looks like we've contained the infection for the time being. All right, let's get everyone off as soon as possible. Does the lift work? It does. Jonathan ran to his room and grabbed his bag. Then he joined Colonel Bartell and the two officers in the lift. The door shut, and then the light flickered. Damn no, they were not out of trouble yet. But the lift jumped into motion and reached the other side of the station after what had to be the longest 5 minutes of Jonathan's life. When Jonathan came out of the lift, there was a squeal and Gaby ran across the foyer to him. Jonathan! She flung her arms around his neck. He lifted her off the ground and swung her around. When he set her back on the ground, he noticed that her cheeks were wet. Oh, that's not really necessary. No one said I wouldn't come back. He wiped the tears away with his thumbs, but new ones rolled down. They took you away. You didn't come back, and they said you escaped. They said that they wanted you about the disappearance of this man, and then the lights went off. I was so worried. It's all okay now. And it was, on a small scale, even though Colonel Bartell's men were making preparations for the evacuation. Then he decided to do something he should have done days, maybe months ago. He held out his hands. Gaby, we have a task to fight this overwhelming enemy. Will you fight by my side as my colleague and my partner in life? Her face split into a broad grin. Oh, Jonathan. She wiped more tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand, and then she brushed his lips with hers. Of course. You're the craziest person I've ever met. My life would be very boring without you. Thank you for listening to Extermination. For other books in this series, visit my website, pattyjansen.com.